Caleb Whitmore's hand closed around the return ticket in his coat pocket the moment he saw her step off that train, already rehearsing the words that would send her straight back where she came from. Then she looked up at him with eyes swollen from crying, and whispered she had nowhere left to go. He had sworn never again to let another woman into his heart. He never expected a stranger's tears to be the thing that cracked it wide open. If you're watching this story right now, hit subscribe, stay with me until the very end, and drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Caleb Whitmore rode into Red Hollow Station with his jaw locked tight and a single purpose burning in his chest. He was going to send her back. Whoever she was, whatever she looked like, however far she had traveled, it didn't matter. He dismounted before his horse had even fully stopped, boots hitting the platform hard enough that a few heads turned. His sister's letter was still folded in his breast pocket, and he could recite every infuriating word of it by memory. "I know you told me never again, Caleb, but I did it anyway. Her name is Clara. She's a good woman. Please just give her a chance before you send her away." A chance. He'd given 5 women a chance. 5. And every single one had left him standing in an empty house, wondering what was wrong with him, or worse, knowing exactly what was wrong, and choosing to leave anyway. Never again, he'd told his sister. Never again, he'd told himself, standing over 2 graves 7 winters ago. He wasn't about to break that promise for a woman he'd never met, arranged behind his back like some kind of surprise. The station master, old Henry Coates, tipped his hat as Caleb approached. "Little early, aren't you, Mr. Whitmore? Train's not due for another 20 minutes. "I know when the train's due, Henry." "Didn't mean nothing by it." Henry scratched at his gray whiskers. "Just seems you're in an awful hurry to meet somebody you don't want to meet." Caleb's eyes cut toward him. "Who told you that?" "Ranch hands talk. Everybody in this valley's heard by now. Caleb Whitmore's getting another mail-order bride, and everybody's taking bets on how long before she runs off crying." Heat rose up the back of Caleb's neck. "There won't be a bride. There's not going to be a wedding. I'm putting her right back on this train before she takes one step past that platform." "That's so." Henry didn't sound convinced. "You already talked to her. Know anything about her at all?" "I know enough." "You know her name?" Caleb hesitated. "Clara." "Clara what?" He didn't answer because he genuinely didn't know, and the silence that followed felt like an accusation. Henry chuckled low in his throat and walked off to check his pocket watch against the station clock, leaving Caleb alone with his own irritation and the growing uncomfortable feeling that he was about to do something he would regret. He told himself it was the right thing. The kind thing, even. Better to end this quickly, cleanly, before either of them wasted a single day pretending this arrangement could work. He'd pay for her return fare. He'd apologize for his sister's meddling. He'd make sure she had food for the journey back. He wasn't a cruel man. He just wasn't a man who could try again. Not after everything he'd lost. The whistle sounded in the distance, and something in Caleb's chest tightened without his permission. He watched the train grow from a smudge on the horizon into a roaring, hissing beast of iron and steam, and with every passing second, his resolve hardened into something like armor. Send her back. Pay the fare. Go home. That was the plan. The train screeched to a stop in a cloud of steam and dust, and doors began opening all down the line. Passengers stepped down, a family with 3 loud children, a traveling salesman with a case full of tin pots, 2 men in suits arguing about cattle prices. And then Caleb saw her. She stood in the doorway of the passenger car for a long moment before stepping down, as if gathering the last of her courage just to put one foot on the platform. Her dress was brown, faded from wear, and travel dust ground into the hem from what must have been days on the road before she'd even reached the train. She carried one small suitcase, battered at the corners, held in both hands like it contained everything she owned in the world, which Caleb would soon learn it did. Her hair had come loose from its pins, somewhere along the journey, strands of dark blonde falling around a face that was pale with exhaustion. She looked around the unfamiliar platform, at the unfamiliar mountains rising behind the unfamiliar town, and something in her expression cracked. A single tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away fast, like she was ashamed of it, like she'd hoped no one would see. Caleb saw. He had expected demanding. He had expected calculating, or nervous, or falsely sweet, the way some of the others had been syrup poured over ambition. He had prepared himself for almost anything except this, a woman standing utterly alone in a strange place, trying so hard not to fall apart that her whole body seemed to be shaking with the effort of staying upright. For one full second, he forgot why he'd come. Then he remembered, and he made himself walk forward, boots heavy on the platform boards. She saw him coming. Something shifted in her face. Not relief, not hope, but a kind of bracing, like she already expected to be disappointed and simply wanted to get it over with. "Mr. Whitmore." Her voice was quiet, careful. "That's right. I'm Clara Bennett." She extended a gloved hand that trembled slightly. "Your sister told me you'd be expecting me." Caleb didn't take her hand right away. "My sister told you a lot of things, I imagine." Something flickered across Clara's face. Confusion, maybe. Or the first crack of understanding. She said... Clara stopped herself, glanced down at her suitcase, then back up. "She said you were a good man, a hard worker, that you'd been alone too long and didn't know how to ask for help." She had no right to say any of that. "No," Clara said slowly. "I suppose she didn't." The train behind her let out a long hiss of steam, preparing to continue on its route, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Caleb watched her hands tighten around the handle of her suitcase. "Miss Bennett," he started, and he heard how formal it sounded, how final. "I think there's been a mistake." "A mistake. My sister arranged this without my knowledge or my consent. I never agreed to any of it. I'm sorry you traveled all this way, truly, but I intend to put you back on this train and cover the cost of your return ticket. You'll be back home within the week." He watched her absorb the words, watched the exhaustion in her eyes shift into something sharper, something that looked almost like fear, trying very hard to disguise itself as calm. "I see," she said. "I'll speak with the station master about the next departure." "Mr. Whitmore." Her voice cut through his quiet, but firm enough to stop him. "The train is leaving in a few minutes. This one. Right now. There'll be another. Not for 3 days." She said it plainly without drama, but something underneath the words trembled. "And even then, I don't have money for the return fare." Caleb frowned. "I said I'd cover the cost." "That's very generous." Clara's chin lifted slightly, some flicker of pride surfacing through the exhaustion. "But it doesn't solve the larger problem." "Which is?" She was quiet for a long moment, and Caleb watched her decide whether to say, it watched the war happening behind her eyes. "I sold everything I owned to come here," she finally said. "My father's house, what furniture we had left. My mother's wedding ring, which I never thought I'd part with, but I needed the money for the ticket and for food along the way. There is nothing left behind me to go back to Mr. Whitmore. No house, no family waiting, nothing." The words landed like a physical blow. Caleb had prepared himself for tears, for pleading, for anger. He had not prepared himself for simple, devastating facts stated without a trace of self-pity. "Your family. My father passed 2 years ago. My mother, the year before that. I have a sister in St. Louis with 6 children and a husband who can barely feed the ones he has." Clara's voice never rose, never broke, though he could see what it cost her to keep it that way. "This was supposed to be a new start. I understand if that isn't what you want. But I'm asking you to understand that I have nowhere else to go." The train whistle blew again, sharper this time, a final warning. Caleb looked at the train, looked at Clara, looked at the small crowd of townspeople who had gathered at a polite distance, pretending not to watch the drama unfolding on the platform while watching every second of it. For the first time in 7 years, Caleb Whitmore had absolutely no idea what to do. "Get on the train, Whitmore," someone muttered from the small crowd, and he recognized the voice as one of Walter Hayes's ranch hands, always eager to see him fail. "Send her packing like you did the last one." Clara's eyes flicked toward the voice, and Caleb saw something in her face he hadn't expected, not humiliation, but anger. a quiet, controlled fury at being discussed like she wasn't standing right there. "I am not a package to be sent," she said loud enough for the ranch hand to hear, though her eyes never left Caleb's face. "And I would ask that you make your decision based on what's actually happening here, and not on whatever reputation precedes me, before I've even had the chance to speak 2 words to you." Caleb almost smiled. Almost. The train's final whistle screamed, and steam billowed as the great iron wheels began to turn. He had seconds to decide. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath and turned to Henry Coates, who was watching the entire scene with poorly disguised interest. "She's not getting on this train." "Didn't figure she would," Henry said. Caleb turned back to Clara, whose expression had gone carefully blank, bracing for whatever came next. "You'll stay at the boarding house in town," he said, "just until the situation is sorted out properly. I'm not agreeing to a marriage, Miss Bennett. I want to be entirely clear about that." "I understand. I mean it. This isn't me changing my mind about anything except letting you freeze on a platform tonight." "I understand, Mr. Whitmore." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched her mouth, though her eyes remained wary. "You don't need to apologize for your own kindness. It won't be held against you later." That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Because when Caleb reached down to help her with her suitcase, she flinched, a small involuntary movement quickly hidden, and he noticed for the first time the way she favored her right side, the careful stiffness in how she walked toward the wagon. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm fine." "You're not walking fine." "It's nothing. A fall during the journey. It's already healing." He didn't believe her, not entirely, but he also recognized the particular tone of a woman who had learned not to ask for help, and he decided against every instinct telling him to stay uninvolved, not to push. Not yet. They rode to town in near silence, the wagon wheels creaking over the dirt road, and Caleb found himself sneaking glances at the woman beside him, trying to reconcile the calm, composed voice with the exhausted, grieving face he'd first seen on the platform. "You didn't have to defend yourself back there," he said eventually. "To that man." "Yes, I did." Clara kept her eyes forward. "If I let people speak about me like I have no voice in my own life, they'll keep doing it. I learned that the hard way." "How's that?" She didn't answer right away, and Caleb didn't push, though. The silence sat heavy between them, full of things neither of them said. "What happened to your family, if you don't mind my asking?" he finally said, mostly to fill the quiet. "Fever took my mother. My father's heart gave out not long after the doctor said grief killed him as much as anything else." Clara's hands folded tightly in her lap. "I nursed them both. I know what it looks like when someone loses the will to keep living, Mr. Whitmore. I promised myself I would never let that happen to me, no matter what life took away." Caleb's grip on the reins tightened. He knew exactly what she meant. He'd felt that same pull in the months after the storm took Sarah and his brother Thomas. The particular gravity of grief that tried to drag a person down into the ground with the people they'd lost. He'd fought it. Some days he still fought it. "The town boarding house is run by a woman named Mrs. Pruitt," he said, changing the subject before it could go somewhere he wasn't ready to follow. "She'll see you're fed and settled. I'll cover the cost for now. I'll pay you back." "You don't need to worry about that." "I do, actually." Clara turned to look at him directly for the first time since the platform. "I don't want to be anyone's charity, Mr. Whitmore. I've had enough of feeling helpless to last me a lifetime. If I'm going to stay in this town even for a few days, I intend to earn my keep." Something about the fierceness in her voice caught him off guard. "There's no work for you at the boarding house," he said. "Then I'll find work elsewhere." "Doing what?" "Whatever's needed. I can cook. I can sew. I can clean. Keep books, tend to garden, nurse the sick. I'm not afraid of hard work. Mr. Whitmore, whatever assumptions you've made about mail-order brides." Caleb glanced sideways at her, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, something in his chest loosened just slightly. "I haven't made any assumptions," he said. "Yes, you have. Everyone does." She looked back toward the road ahead. "I don't blame you for it. I imagine the women who came before me gave you plenty of reason." He didn't answer that because she wasn't wrong, and he wasn't ready to talk about the parade of disappointments that had led him to that platform with a return ticket in his pocket. They reached the boarding house as the sun began sinking low over the western ridge, painting the sky in bruised purples and burning orange. Mrs. Pruitt, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, took one look at Clara and immediately began fussing over her exhaustion, her thinness, the state of her travel-worn dress. "Lord, child, you look like you haven't eaten in a week." "I'm fine, ma'am." "You're not fine, you're skin and bone. Come inside, I'll fix you something proper." Caleb watched Clara square her shoulders and follow Mrs. Pruitt inside without complaint, without a single word of self-pity, and something about her quiet endurance stayed with him long after he'd ridden away from town. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself this was temporary, a brief inconvenience, before things returned to normal. He was wrong, though it would take him longer than he'd like to admit to understand exactly how wrong. The next morning, Caleb woke before dawn out of habit, the ranch demanding attention whether he was in the mood to give it or not. Cattle needed moving, fences needed mending, and Walter Hayes had been making noise again about property lines that Caleb knew for a fact were settled 30 years ago. He didn't think about Clara Bennett at all. He told himself that at least 4 separate times before noon, which should have told him something. It was his foreman, a weathered man named Otis Grant, who'd worked the Whitmore land since before Caleb was born, who brought up the subject first. "Heard you didn't send the girl back," Otis said, leaning against the corral fence while Caleb checked a mare's shoe. "News travels fast." "Small town. Nothing else to talk about but you." Otis spat to the side. "She really got nowhere else to go." "That's what she says." "You believe her?" Caleb straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Doesn't much matter what I believe. She's not my responsibility. She's staying at the boarding house until she figures out her next move." Otis didn't sound convinced. "And how's she planning on paying for that boarding house, seeing as you said she didn't have 2 coins to rub together?" Caleb hadn't thought that far ahead, and the realization irritated him more than it should have. "She said she'd find work in Red Hollow doing what ain't exactly a booming metropolis boss." Caleb didn't have an answer for that, and the not having an answer bothered him for the rest of the day, gnawing at the edges of his concentration while he worked until finally, against every instinct telling him to leave well enough alone. He rode back into town that evening. He told himself he was only checking on the situation, making sure she hadn't been swindled or mistreated. Nothing more. He found her in the boarding house kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in a basin of dishwater, laughing at something Mrs. Pruitt had said. The laugh stopped when she saw him standing in the doorway, replaced by that same careful, bracing look from the platform. "Mr. Whitmore." "Miss Bennett." He glanced at the basin of dishes. "Mrs. Pruitt has you working already." I offered. Clara dried her hands on her apron. "I told you I wasn't going to sit idle. Doing dishes doesn't pay for a room." "No, but it's a start, and Mrs. Pruitt has been kind enough to reduce my rate in exchange for help around the house." Clara's chin lifted slightly, that same flash of pride he'd noticed on the platform. "I'm working on finding more permanent employment. There's a seamstress in town who might need an assistant." "Mrs. Alden." "You know her. Everyone knows everyone in Red Hollow." Caleb shifted his weight, suddenly unsure why he'd come at all, what he'd expected to find or say. "How's your injury?" Clara's expression flickered with surprise that he'd remembered, or perhaps surprise that he'd asked. "Better, truly. It was only a bad fall, nothing broken." "You should have a doctor look at it regardless." "I don't have money for a doctor, Mr. Whitmore." The blunt honesty of it hit him again, the same way it had on the platform, not designed to elicit pity, simply stated as fact, and somehow that made it land harder. "Doc Ellison owes me a favor," Caleb heard himself say. "I'll send him by tomorrow." "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to." Clara studied him for a long moment, something calculating behind her tired eyes, though not in an unkind way, more like she was trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't expected to encounter. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Whitmore?" she finally asked. "You made it very clear yesterday that you have no interest in continuing this arrangement. I understand that and I respect it, but you keep showing up." Caleb didn't have a good answer because he didn't fully understand it himself. "Guilty conscience, maybe," he said. "My sister put you in this position. Feels wrong to just wash my hands of it entirely." "That's a kind excuse." "It's not an excuse. It's the truth." "Is it?" Clara's eyes held his, and something about her directness unsettled him more than any of the tears or pleading he'd braced himself for the day before. "Because it seems to me that a man who truly wanted nothing to do with someone wouldn't ride into town 2 days in a row to check on her." Caleb had no response to that, and the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "I should get back to the ranch," he finally said. "Of course." He turned to leave, then stopped some impulse he didn't fully understand pulling the words out of him before he could stop them. "The seamstress position. If it doesn't work out, there's always work at the ranch. Cooking, mending, that sort of thing. The men eat like animals, and none of them know one end of a needle from the other." Clara blinked, clearly not expecting the offer. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Whitmore?" "I'm saying there's honest work if you need it, nothing more. And where would I stay?" Caleb hadn't thought that far, and he heard how the offer sounded the moment she asked the impropriety of it hanging in the air between them. "There's a small room off the kitchen," he said slowly, working it out as he spoke. "My housekeeper used to stay there before she married and moved to town. It's separate from the main house, proper and respectable." "I see. You wouldn't be obligated to anything beyond honest work for honest pay. I'm not trying to trap you into a marriage you didn't ask for, Miss Bennett. I'm offering employment. Nothing else." Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "After everything you said yesterday." Caleb thought about it. Really thought about it, and the honest answer surprised even him. "Because you didn't cry and beg on that platform yesterday even though you had every right to. And because something tells me you're not the kind of woman who's going to disappear the moment things get difficult." He shrugged, uncomfortable with how much truth was in the words. "That's more than I can say for the last 5. Something shifted in Clara's face. Not quite trust, not yet, but the first crack in the wall she'd built since stepping off that train. "I'll think about it," she said. "Take your time." But Caleb already suspected riding back to the ranch under a sky full of stars that she would say yes. And he suspected with a growing unease he couldn't quite name that saying yes to Clara Bennett might change more than just who was cooking dinner in his kitchen. 3 days later, Clara arrived at the Whitmore ranch with her single battered suitcase and an expression of fierce determination that made Otis Grant raise his eyebrows at Caleb from across the yard. "That the girl. That's her. She know what she's walking into, 15 hungry men and a boss who hasn't smiled since the Garfield administration. She knows enough." Clara approached suitcase in hand, chin lifted in that way Caleb was already starting to recognize as her armor against the world. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Miss Bennett, glad you decided to take the position." "The seamstress hired her niece instead," Clara said plainly. "So the timing worked out if nothing else." "Well, our loss is my gain, I suppose." The corner of Clara's mouth twitched almost a smile, and Caleb felt something warm and unfamiliar flicker in his chest before he firmly shut it down. He showed her to the small room off the kitchen, watched her set her suitcase down with the careful, deliberate movements of someone accustomed to having very little and taking excellent care of what she did have. "The kitchen's yours to run as you see fit," he said. "The men aren't picky, but they eat like they're starving, so plan accordingly. There's a garden out back that hasn't been properly tended since—" He stopped himself. In a while, he finished, and Clara didn't push, though he could see the question sitting behind her eyes. That night, for the first time in longer than he cared to count, Caleb came home to the smell of something actually cooking rather than the cold silence of an empty house. The ranch hands ate at the long table, in near-reverent silence, shoveling down stew and fresh bread, like men who'd forgotten what a proper meal tasted like. "Ma'am," One of the younger hands, a boy named Tommy, who couldn't have been more than 19, sat around a mouthful of bread. "This is about the best thing I've eaten since my mama passed." Clara's expression softened in a way Caleb hadn't seen before. "I'm sorry about your mother." "Ain't your fault, ma'am. Just meant it as a compliment." "I know, thank you." She refilled his bowl without being asked, and Tommy's face lit up like he'd been handed gold. Caleb watched the exchange from the head of the table, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar twisting in his chest. It had been so long since the ranch felt like anything other than a place men worked and slept, that the sudden warmth of it, the laughter, the easy conversation, the smell of bread rising in the oven, felt almost disorienting. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know what to do with her. Over the following days, Clara settled into the rhythm of ranch life with a determination that impressed even the hardest of the hands. She woke before the sun had breakfast ready, before the men stumbled out to the barn, and somehow found time between meals to mend torn shirts, organize the chaotic supply room, and coax the neglected garden back toward something resembling productivity. She never complained. She never asked Caleb for anything beyond what the job required. And slowly, without either of them quite acknowledging it, she began to notice things about him that he thought he'd hidden well enough. "You don't sleep," she said one evening, finding him awake at the kitchen table long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, a bottle of whiskey untouched in front of him. "I sleep fine. You don't." She set a cup of coffee in front of him instead of the whiskey, and he noticed she'd quietly moved the bottle out of easy reach. "I hear you pacing most nights. The floorboards outside my room creak." "I didn't realize I was keeping you awake." "You're not. I just notice things." Clara sat across from him uninvited, though he found he didn't mind. "What keeps you up, Mr. Whitmore?" He almost told her to mind her own business. The words were right there, ready to be spoken, the same defensive wall he'd built and reinforced for 7 straight years. Instead, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he found himself saying, "Ghosts mostly." Clara didn't push, didn't pry, simply nodded like the answer made perfect sense to her. "I understand ghosts," she said quietly. "Mine visit most nights, too." They sat in silence for a while, after that, 2 people carrying separate griefs that somehow, without either of them planning it, made the silence between them feel less lonely than the silence either of them had grown used to. "Thank you," Caleb finally said, "for the coffee." "You're welcome." Clara stood gathering the empty whiskey glass along with her own cup. At the doorway she paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Whitmore, whatever you lost, it wasn't your fault. I don't know the details, and you don't owe me any explanation. But I've watched enough grieving men to recognize the particular way guilt sits on a person's shoulders. And I promise you, whatever happened carrying that weight alone isn't honoring anyone's memory. It's just making you disappear a little more every day." She left before he could respond, and Caleb sat alone at the table, long after her footsteps faded, turning her words over and over until the sky outside began to lighten with the first gray edges of dawn. For the first time in 7 years, he wondered if she might be right. The weeks that followed brought a change to the Whitmore ranch that even the most stubborn hands couldn't ignore. The kitchen, once cold and functional, became the beating heart of the household. Clara had a way of drawing people out of themselves, coaxing shy Tommy into telling stories about his family back east, getting gruff old Otis to laugh so hard he nearly choked on his coffee, even convincing the perpetually sullen ranch hand Marcus to admit he missed his mother's cooking more than he'd ever admit out loud. And Caleb watched all of it happen from the edges, telling himself he was simply observing, simply grateful for the improved morale among his men. He was lying to himself, and some part of him knew it. "You're staring again," Otis said one afternoon, catching Caleb watching through the kitchen window as Clara hung laundry, humming something under her breath, sunlight catching the gold in her dark blonde hair. "I'm not staring. I'm checking the weather." Through the kitchen window at the woman doing laundry instead of the sky. Otis grinned, the expression deeply unwelcome on his weathered face. Boss, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. I know staring when I see it. Get back to work, Otis. Yes, sir? Otis didn't move, still grinning. Just saying, it's good to see you looking at something besides the bottom of a whiskey glass for once. Caleb didn't dignify that with a response, though the words stuck with him longer than he wanted to admit. That evening, returning from a long day inspecting fence lines along the eastern property, Caleb found Clara sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the sunset, with an expression of quiet, private sadness that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. "Everything all right?" he asked, dismounting. Clara startled slightly, quickly composing her features into something more neutral. "Fine, just thinking." "About—" She hesitated, and Caleb almost withdrew the question, respecting whatever boundaries she was clearly weighing. "Today would have been my mother's birthday," she finally said. She always loved sunsets like this one. Said the sky looked like it was on fire, celebrating something we couldn't see. Caleb sat down beside her on the steps, close enough to offer comfort, far enough to respect the space she might need. "Tell me about her," he said. "Your mother." Clara looked at him with surprise, like she hadn't expected the invitation. "You don't have to do that. Pretend to be interested." "I'm not pretending." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she began to talk hesitantly at first, then with growing warmth about a mother who'd taught her to cook, to sew, to stand up straight, and speak her mind, even when the world wanted women to stay small and quiet. She talked about a father who'd worked himself to exhaustion, trying to keep their small farm afloat, about nursing them both through their final illnesses, about the particular loneliness of losing everyone who'd known you since birth. Caleb listened without interrupting, without offering the empty platitudes people usually reached for in the face of grief. He simply listened the way he wished someone had listened to him 7 years ago, before the whole town had settled into treating his loss like something to whisper about, rather than something to actually acknowledge. "You're a good listener," Clara said when she finished wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I've had practice being quiet." "That's not the same thing." "No," he admitted. "I suppose it's not." They sat together as the sun finally dipped below the western ridge, the sky darkening from fire to deep purple, to the first scattered stars, and neither of them moved to break the silence. Both of them, for entirely different reasons, feeling less alone than they had in longer than they could remember. It was Clara who finally spoke, her voice soft in the deepening dark. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Whitmore?" "Caleb," he said. "I think we're past Mr. Whitmore by now." Something warm touched her expression. "Caleb, then. Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "What were their names?" "Your wife and your brother." The question hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he considered deflecting, changing the subject, retreating back behind the walls he'd spent 7 years building. But something about the gentle way she'd asked, without pity, without the morbid curiosity he'd grown accustomed to from the townspeople, made him want to answer. "Sarah," he said quietly. "My wife's name was Sarah, and my brother was Thomas. Tell me about them." And so, for the first time in 7 years, Caleb Whitmore did. He told her about Sarah's laugh, how it filled the entire house, how she'd insisted on planting flowers, even though everyone told her the Wyoming soil was too harsh for anything but hardy vegetables and stubborn grass. He told her about Thomas, 3 years younger, always following Caleb around the ranch, trying to prove himself capable of a man's work despite being barely 16. He told her about the winter storm that came without warning, about Sarah and Thomas riding out to bring in the last of the cattle before the blizzard hit full force, about waiting by the window for hours that stretched into an eternity of dread, about finding them. 3 days later, after the storm finally broke, huddled together beneath a rocky outcropping less than 2 miles from the house, having lost their way in the whiteout conditions. "I should have gone with them," Caleb said, his voice rough with an old grief that had never fully healed. "I was recovering from a fever. Sarah insisted I stay inside rest. Thomas said he could handle it alone, and I let him because some foolish part of me thought it would be good for him to prove himself." He stared out at the darkness, unable to look at Clara while he spoke. I've spent 7 years wondering if I'd gone with them, if things would have turned out differently. Clara reached over tentatively and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. You couldn't have known, she said softly. A storm like that coming without warning, that's not a failure of judgment, Caleb. That's simply the terrible random cruelty of the world. That's what everyone says. Do you believe it? He was quiet for a long moment. Some days. That's honest, at least. Clara's thumb traced a small comforting circle across the back of his hand. For what it's worth, I don't think Sarah or Thomas would want you spending the rest of your life alone as some kind of penance for surviving. I think they'd want you to live fully, without guilt, weighing down every good thing that comes your way. Caleb turned to look at her, then really look at her, and something passed between them in the darkness. Something neither of them was ready to name, but both of them felt with startling, undeniable clarity. Clara, he started. Caleb, she said, at the exact same moment, and they both fell silent. The air between them suddenly charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. He wanted to lean forward. He wanted to close the distance between them and discover whether her lips would taste like the coffee she'd made him. Whether her hands would feel as steady against his face as they did against his own trembling fingers. He wanted to, and the wanting terrified him more than anything had in 7 long years. He pulled back first. It's getting late, he said, standing too quickly, putting distance between them like the space itself could undo whatever had just happened. You should get some rest. Clara's expression flickered, hurt, quickly masked, replaced with the same careful composure she wore like armor. Of course. Good night, Caleb. Good night, Clara. He watched her walk back into the house, and once she was gone, he sat back down on the porch steps alone, staring up at a sky full of stars, wondering what exactly he thought he was protecting himself from, and why the answer felt less certain than it had just 1 hour before. The days that followed carried a new kind of tension between them. Not unpleasant exactly, but charged with an awareness neither of them addressed directly. Clara continued her work around the ranch with the same quiet dedication. But Caleb noticed the way her eyes would find his across the kitchen table. The way conversation between them had grown easier, warmer, filled with an intimacy that went beyond simple employer and employee. He also noticed with growing unease the way the town had begun to talk. Heard the Whitmore girl's been living out at your place for near a month now. Walter Hayes said one afternoon, cornering Caleb outside the general store with the particular smugness of a man who enjoyed stirring trouble. Awful cozy arrangement for a woman who's not your wife. She's my employee, Hayes. Same as any of my ranch hands. That what you're calling it? Walter's smile didn't reach his eyes. Folks in town are starting to wonder about the propriety of it all. A single woman living alone with a bachelor rancher, no chaperone in sight. My men live at the ranch too, 15 of them. Ranch hands sleeping in the bunkhouse is one thing. A pretty young woman sleeping in a room right off your kitchen is something else entirely, and you know it. Walter's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. Just looking out for your reputation, Whitmore. Wouldn't want people getting the wrong idea about you and your little mail-order bride. She's not my bride. Then what exactly is she? Caleb didn't have a good answer, and the absence of one bothered him for the rest of the day, following him through his chores like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. That evening, he found Clara in the kitchen, methodically kneading bread dough with more force than the task strictly required. Her jaw tight with some emotion she was clearly trying to contain. Bad day? He asked. Mrs. Pruitt visited earlier. Said some of the ladies in town have been talking. Clara didn't look up from the dough. Apparently my living arrangement here is causing quite the scandal. I heard something similar from Walter Hayes. That got her attention. Clara's hands stilled flour dusting her fingers as she looked up at him. What did he say? Nothing worth repeating. Caleb. Her voice carried a warning. What did he say? Caleb sighed, leaning against the doorframe. He implied our arrangement was improper, that your reputation and mine might suffer if things continue as they are. Something flickered across Clara's face, and Caleb couldn't quite identify whether it was hurt anger or a complicated mixture of both. "And what do you think?" she asked quietly. "Do you think our arrangement is improper? I think Walter Hayes has wanted my land for 15 years and will use any excuse he can find to cause trouble." "That's not what I asked." Caleb met her eyes directly. "I think you're the best thing that's happened to this ranch in 7 years, and I refuse to let small-minded gossip change that." Clara's breath caught slightly, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with everything unsaid. "That's kind of you to say," she finally managed. "It's not kindness, it's the truth." "Caleb, I mean it, Clara." He stepped closer, some instinct overriding his usual caution. "I don't care what Walter Hayes thinks or what the ladies in town whisper about over their afternoon tea. You've done more for this ranch, for these men, for me, than anyone has in longer than I care to admit." "But," Clara asked, sensing the hesitation underneath his words. "I hear a but coming." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his own inability to say what he actually meant. "But I don't know what any of this means. What we're doing here. What I'm allowed to feel after everything." "Allowed?" Clara set down the dough entirely now, giving him her full attention. "Caleb, there's no rule book for grief. No timeline that says you've mourned long enough, and now it's acceptable to feel something for someone else." "Isn't there?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "Sarah's been gone 7 years, Clara. 7 years, and there are still nights I wake up reaching for her before I remember she's not there. How am I supposed to reconcile that with—" He gestured vaguely between them. "With whatever this is." Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression of such profound understanding that it nearly undid him entirely. "Loving someone new doesn't erase the people you lost," she finally said, her voice gentle but certain. "Your heart doesn't get smaller because it learns to hold more than one person, Caleb. If anything, I think it gets bigger, stronger, more capable of carrying love, precisely because it's already survived losing some." The words settled into Caleb's chest like a key finally turning in a lock that had been stuck for 7 long years. "How do you know that?" he asked quietly. "How can you be so certain?" "I don't know it," Clara admitted. "Not with certainty. But I choose to believe it, because the alternative is spending the rest of my life afraid to feel anything at all, and I refuse to let grief steal my entire future, the way it already stole so much of my past." Caleb closed the remaining distance between them, close enough now that he could see the flower dust on her cheek. The exhaustion still lingering beneath her eyes, the fierce, stubborn hope she'd carried with her since stepping off that train nearly a month ago. "Clara," he said softly, "I think I'm starting to fall in love with you, and it terrifies me more than anything has in 7 years." Her breath caught audibly, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he might retreat from the confession the way he had on the porch steps. He didn't retreat. "I'm terrified too," she whispered, "but I'd rather be terrified with you than safe and alone for the rest of my life." He kissed her, then finally months of careful distance collapsing into a single moment of surrender neither of them had fully believed possible. Her hands came up to rest against his chest, and he could feel her heart racing beneath his palm, matching the frantic rhythm of his own. When they finally broke apart, both of them slightly breathless, Clara rested her forehead against his, a small disbelieving laugh escaping her. "Well," she said, "Walter Hayes is going to have quite a lot more to gossip about now." Caleb laughed a real laugh, the first genuine, unguarded laugh he'd allowed himself in 7 long years. And something about the sound of it echoing through a kitchen that had finally truly become a home again made Clara's eyes fill with tears of an entirely different kind than the ones she'd cried on that train platform a month before. But even as they stood together in that fragile, precious moment of newfound happiness, neither of them knew that Walter Hayes was already setting into motion a plan far more dangerous than mere gossip. A plan that would threaten not only their fledgling love, but everything Caleb Whitmore had spent his entire life building. The storm that had taken Sarah and Thomas 7 years ago had been an act of nature unpredictable and merciless. The storm now gathering on the horizon of Caleb and Clara's future would be entirely deliberately man-made, and it would test both of their hearts in ways neither of them could yet imagine. 3 days after that kiss in the kitchen, Walter Hayes rode into Red Hollow with a lawyer from Cheyenne sitting stiff and silent beside him in the buggy, and by sundown, the whole valley knew something ugly was coming. Caleb heard about it from Otis first. "Man's got a briefcase, boss." Otis said the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. "Fancy leather one. Ain't never seen a briefcase in this town that brought good news." "What's he saying?" "Says he's got documents, old survey records. Says the eastern boundary of your property ain't where everybody's always thought it was." Otis spat into the dirt. "Says near 200 acres of Whitmore land actually belongs to Hayes." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. "That land's been in my family for 30 years. My father filed those boundary papers himself." That's what I told him. He just smiled that ugly smile of his and said, "Paper's paper, and sometimes paper gets lost, and sometimes paper gets found again in a filing cabinet nobody bothered checking." Caleb was already moving toward his horse before Otis finished talking. He found Walter Hayes standing outside the land office, with the lawyer looking entirely too pleased with himself for a man about to be told he was wrong. "Whitmore!" Walter tipped his hat with mocking politeness. "Was wondering when you'd hear." "What is this, Hayes?" "Just business." Walter nodded to the lawyer, a thin, nervous man named Prescott, who wouldn't quite meet Caleb's eyes. "Mr. Prescott here found some old county records suggesting the boundary line between our properties was surveyed incorrectly back in your father's time. 200 acres, give or take. Prime grazing land, as it happens, sits right along the creek. That's the best water on my property. Funny how that works out." Walter's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Course I'm not an unreasonable man. I'm sure we can come to some arrangement one neighbor to another." "There's no arrangement to make. That land is mine. My father's deed is on file at the county courthouse." "Is it?" Walter's eyebrows lifted with theatrical innocence. "Funny thing about courthouses, Whitmore. Records get misplaced. Fires happen. Water damage. I'd hate for you to go looking for that deed and discover it's not quite where you remember leaving it." The threat landed clear and cold, and Caleb felt something dangerous rise up in his chest. "Are you telling me you tampered with county records, Hayes?" "I'm telling you nothing of the sort." Walter's voice stayed smooth, unbothered. "I'm simply saying that Mr. Prescott has done his research, and the research suggests I have a legitimate claim. We'll let a judge sort out the particulars if it comes to that." "It'll come to that. I rather thought it might." Walter's eyes flicked past Caleb's shoulder toward the street. "Though I imagine you've got other things occupying your attention these days. Heard you've got yourself a live-in house guest. Pretty little thing from what I hear. Awful convenient arrangement for a man who claims he wants nothing more to do with mail-order brides. Leave her out of this. I'm not the one who brought a stranger into my home with no chaperone, no ring, no proper arrangement of any kind." Walter's smile turned razor-thin. "Folks talk, Whitmore. And when folks talk about a man's judgment in his personal affairs, it does tend to color how they view his judgment in his business affairs, too. Might be worth keeping in mind when this land dispute finds its way in front of a judge." Caleb's hands curled into fists at his sides, every instinct screaming at him to close the distance and wipe that smug expression clean off Walter Hayes's face. He didn't. 7 years of discipline held him in place, though it cost him more than he'd admit. "You're threatening me." "I'm giving you friendly advice." Walter climbed back into his buggy, unhurried, savoring every second of Caleb's barely contained fury. "Might want to think real careful about what kind of reputation you want walking into that courtroom with you, Whitmore. A respectable rancher defending his family's land is one thing. A lonely widower who took in a stranger off a train and started keeping her in his house well. Juries can be funny about appearances." He snapped the reins and rode off, leaving Caleb standing outside the land office with rage burning through his chest and a cold, creeping dread settling in right behind it. Because Walter wasn't wrong about one thing. Appearances mattered in this town. And Caleb had given people plenty to talk about. He rode home slower than usual, turning the conversation over and over, trying to find an angle that didn't end with either his land or Clara's reputation getting dragged through the mud. He found her in the garden sleeves rolled up pulling weeds from between rows of vegetables that were finally, after weeks of her attention, starting to actually produce something worth eating. She looked up when she heard his horse, and her smile faded the moment she saw his face. "What happened?" "Walter Hayes is trying to steal 200 acres of my land." Clara straightened, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron. "How?" "Claims the original survey was wrong, says he's got documents proving it." Caleb dismounted, dropping the reins over the fence post harder than necessary. "It's a lie. My father surveyed that land himself, filed the deed at the courthouse 30 years ago. But Hayes brought a lawyer, and he's talking about taking it in front of a judge. Can he do that, if the deed's on file? He's implying the deed might not be where it's supposed to be anymore." Caleb's voice went flat with barely restrained anger. "Implying records get lost, or get made to look lost." Clara's eyes narrowed. "He's threatening to tamper with the county records." "That's what it sounded like to me." "That's a crime, Caleb. Try proving it." Caleb leaned against the fence, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. "Man's got money and connections all through this territory. If he wants to make a deed disappear, or make a new one appear, he's got the means to do it." Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking, and Caleb watched something shift behind her eyes, the same sharp, focused expression he'd noticed the day she'd insisted on earning her keep rather than accepting charity. "There's something else," Caleb added, and he watched her brace herself for it. "He brought you up. Said the arrangement here, you living at the ranch, might color how a judge views my character. Said it might work against me in court." Clara's face went carefully blank. "I see." "Clara, he's using me to hurt you." Her voice was steady, but Caleb could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "That's what this is. I'm a weapon he's decided to point at you." "That's not how I see it." "It doesn't matter how you see it, Caleb. It matters how a judge sees it. It matters how this whole town sees it." Clara pulled off her gardening gloves with sharp, angry movements. "I told you from the beginning, I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to be the reason anything in your life got harder. You're not a burden, aren't I?" Her eyes flashed with something between anger and fear. "I show up penniless, move into your house, and within 2 months, you're facing a lawsuit that could cost you 200 acres, partly because a man decided my presence here made you look unfit. Walter Hayes was going to come after this land, regardless of whether you were here or not. He's wanted it for 15 years. But I'm giving him ammunition he wouldn't otherwise have." Caleb stepped closer, taking her hands in his, despite the dirt still clinging to her fingers. "Clara, look at me. I am not going to let that man's greed decide who I let into my life. I've spent 7 years letting fear make my decisions for me. I'm done with that. Even if it cost you the land. The land isn't worth anything if I'm too much of a coward to hold on to the things that actually matter." Something in Clara's face softened, though the worry didn't fully leave her eyes. "I hope you still feel that way when Walter Hayes is standing in front of a judge painting me as some kind of scheming opportunist who seduced her way into your household. He can paint whatever picture he wants. I know the truth. So do you. So does everyone on this ranch who's watched you work yourself to exhaustion for people who aren't even your family." Clara managed a small, tired smile. "You have entirely too much faith in me." "I have exactly the right amount of faith in you." She leaned into him, then resting her head against his chest, and Caleb wrapped his arms around her, wishing he could simply hold the entire situation at bay through sheer force of will. He couldn't, of course, and within a week, the situation grew considerably worse. It started with whispers. Tommy came in from town on a supply run, looking pale and uncomfortable, refusing to meet Clara's eyes when she asked what was wrong. "Tommy," Clara pressed, setting down the bread she'd been kneading. "What happened in town?" "Nothing, ma'am." "Tommy Reyes, I've patched up enough of your scraped knuckles to know when you're lying to me." The boy shifted uncomfortably. Some folks were talking, at the general store, about, about you, ma'am, and Mr. Whitmore. Tommy's face flushed red. Saying things that ain't true. Saying you came out here looking to trap yourself a rich husband. Saying you probably got run out of your last town for the same trick. Clara's hands went very still against the dough. Who was saying this? Didn't recognize most of them, but Mrs. Hutchins was right there nodding along, agreeing with every word. Mrs. Hutchins, Caleb would later learn, was Walter Hayes's second cousin, and the rumor spread through Red Hollow with the speed and precision of something deliberately planted rather than something that had simply grown on its own. By the end of that week, Clara couldn't walk through town without feeling the weight of stares, without hearing the way conversations dropped to whispers the moment she passed. Mrs. Pruitt, loyal as ever, defended her fiercely at every opportunity, but even her defense couldn't stop the tide of gossip that Walter Hayes had clearly set into motion with surgical precision. "They're saying I have a history," Clara told Caleb one evening, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "That I was engaged before back east and broke it off the moment I found a wealthier prospect. That I do this. That I move from town to town, ranch to ranch, chasing money. That's not true." Of course it's not true. But it doesn't matter whether it's true, Caleb. It only matters whether people believe it. Clara paced the length of the kitchen, her composure finally starting to crack under the accumulated weight of weeks of whispers and sideways glances. "Walter Hayes is destroying my reputation to weaken your case in court, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. There has to be something. What I have no family to vouch for my character. No community that's known me longer than 2 months. I have nothing to fight this with except my own word, and apparently my word means very little against a wealthy man's rumors." Caleb watched her fight back tears of pure frustration, and something in his chest twisted painfully at his own helplessness. "I'll talk to Hayes. That'll only make it worse. He wants you angry. He wants you reckless. Don't give him the satisfaction." She was right. And Caleb hated that she was right. Hated the particular kind of powerlessness that came from watching someone he cared about being torn apart by lies with no clear way to fight back. That night, unable to sleep, he found her sitting alone on the porch steps in the darkness, staring out at nothing, her arms wrapped around herself. "Can't sleep either," he asked. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear what they're saying about me. Over and over." Clara's voice was hollow with exhaustion. "I left everything behind, Caleb. Everything I owned, everyone I loved, all of it to build something new. And now this town has decided who I am before they've bothered to actually know me." Caleb sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "You know who you are. I know who you are. That has to be enough." "Does it?" She turned to look at him, eyes glistening in the moonlight. "Because some days it doesn't feel like enough. Some days I wonder if I should have just stayed on that train, gone somewhere no one had ever heard the name Whitmore or Hayes, started over completely fresh where nobody could poison my reputation before I'd even had the chance to earn one." The words hit Caleb harder than he expected. A cold spike of fear at the thought of her simply disappearing, vanishing back into the vast unknown, the way she'd nearly done that first day at the station. "Don't say that." "Why not?" "It might have been easier." "Because I don't want easier." Caleb turned to face her, fully taking her hands in his. "I want you, Clara. Difficult reputation, small-town gossip, Walter Hayes and his lawyers, and every complication that comes along with all of it. I've had easy. Easy was 7 years of an empty house and a heart I kept locked up so tight nothing could hurt me again. I don't want easy anymore." Clara's breath caught, and for a moment the exhaustion and fear in her expression gave way to something raw and hopeful. "You mean that?" "I've never meant anything more." She kissed him, then soft and searching, and for a while the world outside that porch, Walter Hayes, the lawsuit. The whispers in town faded into something distant and unimportant compared to the certainty settling into Caleb's chest. It wouldn't stay that simple for long. The letter arrived 4 days later, delivered by a courier who refused to meet anyone's eyes, addressed formally to Mr. Caleb Whitmore. Caleb read it twice before the words fully registered. "What is it?" Clara asked, watching his face drain of color. Court date set. 2 weeks from Friday. Caleb's hand tightened around the paper. And there's something else. What? Hayes's lawyer is requesting testimony from anyone with knowledge of, and I'm quoting here, the domestic arrangements at the Whitmore property, specifically regarding the presence of Miss Clara Bennett. Clara went very still. He's putting me on trial too. He's trying to? Caleb, if I testify, if they start asking questions about my past, about why I really came here. She stopped herself. Something cold settled into Caleb's stomach. What are you not telling me, Clara? She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Caleb felt the first genuine crack of doubt he'd experienced since the day she stepped off that train. Clara, there's something about my past I haven't told you. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Something I was afraid would change how you see me. Caleb's heart pounded against his ribs. Tell me now, before Walter Hayes's lawyer finds it and uses it against both of us in that courtroom. Clara took a shaking breath. Before my parents died, I was engaged to a man named Edmund Carver. Our families arranged it when I was 17. Her hands twisted together nervously. He was cruel, Caleb. Not in ways anyone outside our engagement ever saw. He controlled everything: what I wore, who I spoke to, how I spent my time. When my parents grew ill, he refused to help pay for their care unless I agreed to move up the wedding date, to seal the arrangement before I had time to think clearly about what I was agreeing to. What happened? I broke it off. 2 weeks before my mother died. He was furious, told everyone in town that I was unstable, ungrateful, that I'd humiliated his family for no reason at all. Tears finally spilled down Clara's cheeks. That's part of why I had nowhere left to go after my parents passed. Edmund made sure the entire town believed the worst of me. It's part of why I couldn't stay. I needed somewhere far away from every person who thought they knew exactly what kind of woman I was. Caleb absorbed this feeling. Something complicated tightened in his chest. Not anger at her, but a fierce protective fury toward a man he'd never met. That's not the same as what Walter Hayes is implying, he said carefully. You didn't run from town to town chasing money. You ran from a man who was trying to control you. Try explaining that distinction to a courtroom full of strangers who've already decided I'm exactly the kind of woman capable of manipulating a grieving widower for his wealth. Clara wiped angrily at her tears. If this comes out in court, Edmund's version of events, or some twisted version of it that Hayes's lawyer constructs, it'll destroy any credibility I have left. Then we make sure it doesn't come out. How? Once we're under oath, we can't simply refuse to answer questions. Caleb didn't have an immediate answer, and the not having one gnawed at him through the rest of that sleepless night, long after Clara had finally cried herself into exhausted, restless sleep. He needed a plan. He needed evidence, something solid enough to counter both Walter Hayes's fabricated land claims and whatever poisoned narrative Edmund Carver's old rumors might resurrect about Clara's character. The answer, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected source. You need the original survey, Otis said the next morning, watching Caleb pace the length of the barn like a caged animal. The one your daddy commissioned. If that still exists somewhere independent of whatever's on file at the courthouse, it'd prove Hayes is lying regardless of what he's done to the county records. My father's papers burned in the house fire 15 years ago. You know that. His personal copies, sure. But your daddy was a careful man. He didn't trust the courthouse to keep good records, even back then, complained about it. Something fierce, if you recall. Caleb stopped pacing. You think he kept a second copy somewhere? I think if there's any man in this territory paranoid enough to keep a second copy of an important document hidden somewhere safe, it was your father. Otis scratched his weathered chin. Man kept a strong box buried somewhere on this property. Told me about it once years back when we'd both had a bit too much whiskey. Never told me exactly where. A strong box. Caleb's mind raced back through childhood memories, fragments of his father's careful, watchful nature. He never mentioned it to me. Maybe he figured he had time to tell you eventually before the fever took him sudden like it did. Caleb spent the rest of that day and most of the next combing through his father's old journals, searching for any clue about a hidden strongbox, any mention of where a careful, paranoid man might have buried something he considered too important to risk losing. Clara helped sitting beside him late into the evening, reading through faded, water-stained pages by lamplight. "Here," she said suddenly, pointing to an entry near the back of one journal. "Listen to this. Buried the important papers today, beneath the old oak where I proposed to Eleanor. Should anything happen to me, know that everything necessary rests exactly where our love began." Caleb's breath caught. Eleanor was my mother's name. Do you know the tree he's talking about? There's only one oak old enough on this property to have been standing when my parents were courting. Caleb was already reaching for his coat. It's on the eastern boundary, the exact section Walter Hayes is claiming. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They rode out to the oak tree in the fading evening light, and it took nearly 2 hours of careful digging beneath its massive gnarled roots before Caleb's shovel finally struck metal. The strongbox, when they pried it open, contained exactly what Otis had hoped for: the original survey document signed and witnessed by 3 separate parties, dated a full 5 years before the boundary dispute Walter Hayes was now attempting to manufacture. "This proves it," Clara breathed, examining the documents by lantern light. "This proves the boundary was always exactly where you said it was." "It's not enough on its own," Caleb said slowly, studying the papers with growing intensity. "Hayes will simply claim these are forgeries too unless we can prove their authenticity beyond question. The witnesses, if any of them are still alive, still in the territory, their testimony combined with these documents would be nearly impossible to dispute." Caleb recognized 2 of the 3 names immediately. Judge Harmon witnessed this. He's still on the bench in Cheyenne, though, not the judge assigned to our case. Thank God, or Hayes would have found some way to disqualify him already. And the other name, Reverend Michaels. Retired now, but he still lives in the valley up near Miller's Creek. Then we need to speak with both of them before the court date. Caleb looked at her in the lantern light, watching the fierce, determined focus that had replaced her earlier despair, and something in his chest swelled with an emotion too large to name. "You're remarkable, you know that. I'm motivated." Clara managed a tired smile. "Nobody takes what's mine without a fight. Not anymore." The visit to Reverend Michaels went smoothly enough. The elderly minister remembered witnessing the survey. Clearly remembered Caleb's father's meticulous, paranoid insistence on documenting everything twice over, and agreed without hesitation to testify on Caleb's behalf. The visit to Judge Harmon proved more complicated. "I appreciate you riding all this way," the retired judge said, settling into a worn leather chair in his modest Cheyenne home. "But I should tell you up front that Walter Hayes has already sent someone to speak with me." Caleb felt his stomach drop. What did they want? Money, presumably, though they were far too clever to phrase it that directly. Judge Harmon's weathered face creased with obvious distaste. "A man came by 2 days ago, offered what he called a generous consulting fee in exchange for my testimony supporting Hayes's boundary claim. Suggested my memory of the original survey might have grown, shall we say, unreliable with age. Did you accept? I threw the man off my property, Mr. Whitmore, along with a rather colorful assessment of his employer's character that I won't repeat in front of the young lady." Judge Harmon's eyes sharpened. "I witnessed that survey personally. Your father was scrupulously honest, unlike the man currently attempting to steal his land. I'll testify to exactly what I saw, exactly as I remember it, and no amount of Walter Hayes's money will change what actually happened." Relief flooded through Caleb, though it was quickly tempered by a fresh wave of concern. "He's trying to buy witnesses," Caleb said grimly once they'd left the judge's house and started the long ride back toward Red Hollow. "Which means he knows we might find the original survey. Which means someone talked. Or he's simply covering every possible angle," Clara suggested. "A man that desperate to steal land probably assumes every possible complication and tries to preempt it. Either way, we need to move faster than he expects." They rode through the night exhausted but energized by the small victory of Judge Harmon's continued integrity and arrived back at the ranch just as dawn began breaking over the eastern hills. What waited for them there stole every ounce of that hard-won relief. The barn was on fire. Flames consumed the entire eastern wall of the structure, black smoke billowing up into the pale morning sky, and the ranch hands were already forming a desperate bucket line from the well faces streaked with soot and panic. The horses. Caleb was off his own horse before it had fully stopped sprinting toward the burning structure with Otis close behind. "Already got most of them out, boss," Otis shouted over the roar of the flames. "But Duchess is still in there. Wouldn't leave her stall spooked something fierce by the smoke." Duchess was Sarah's old mare, the one horse Caleb had never been able to bring himself to sell a living connection to the wife he'd lost 7 years ago. Without hesitation, Caleb grabbed a wet cloth from one of the hands and plunged into the smoke-filled barn. "Caleb!" Clara's scream tore through the chaos behind him, but he was already gone, swallowed by smoke and heat and the terrified screaming of a trapped animal. He found Duchess in her stall, eyes wide with panic, rearing against the flames, licking closer along the dry wooden boards. "Easy, girl. Easy." Caleb pressed the wet cloth over his own mouth and nose, moving slowly despite every instinct screaming at him to hurry, knowing that panic would only make the terrified horse worse. "I've got you. Just trust me." It took precious, dangerous seconds to calm the mare enough to lead her from the stall, seconds during which the fire spread with terrifying speed along the roof beams above them. Seconds during which Caleb genuinely wondered if he'd made a fatal mistake coming back inside. He emerged from the barn, moments before a section of the roof collapsed entirely, leading a still panicked Duchess into the relative safety of the yard, his lungs burning, his face blackened with smoke. Clara reached him first, her hands frantically checking him for injuries, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "Don't you ever do that again," she gasped, half sobbing, half furious. "Don't you ever risk your life like that in front of me again, Caleb Whitmore. Had to get Duchess. You could have died. I didn't. This time." Clara pulled him into a fierce embrace, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of terror. "This time you didn't." They stood together watching the barn burn the ranch hands, eventually managing to contain the flames before they could spread to any other structures, though the barn itself was a near total loss by the time the fire finally died down to smoldering embers. "How did this happen?" Clara asked, once the immediate crisis had passed and the exhausted hands had collapsed onto whatever surface would hold them. Otis approached, his expression grim. "Boss, you're gonna want to see this." He led them to the edge of the barn's remains, pointing toward a scorched patch of earth near the eastern wall, where the unmistakable remains of a broken lantern lay half buried in ash. "That's not one of ours," Otis said quietly. "None of my boys use lanterns like that out here." And the fire started right along this wall, the exact wall facing Hayes's property line. The implications settled over the group like a physical weight. "He's escalating," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "From gossip and forged documents to arson." "You don't know it was him?" Clara said, though her voice carried little conviction. "Who else would benefit from destroying my property 2 weeks before a court date that could cost him 200 acres? Caleb's hands curled into fists. "This isn't a coincidence, Clara. This is Walter Hayes making sure I understand exactly how far he's willing to go. Then we need proof. Proof of arson is nearly impossible unless we catch someone in the act." "Then maybe," Clara said slowly, an idea clearly forming behind her exhausted eyes, "we need to catch him in the act." The plan they devised over the following days was risky, dependent on Walter Hayes's arrogance and his apparent belief that he could continue escalating without consequence. Otis and 2 of the more trustworthy ranch hands took turns keeping careful watch over the property, each night hidden in strategic locations that offered clear sightlines without revealing their presence. Meanwhile, Caleb and Clara continued preparing for the court date, gathering testimony, organizing the recovered survey documents, and trying to present a united, respectable front despite the persistent whispers still circulating through town. It was Tommy on the fourth night of watching who spotted movement near the eastern fence line just past midnight. He came sprinting back to the house breathless and wide-eyed, pounding on the door hard enough to wake the entire household. "Riders!" he gasped when Caleb answered the door with a rifle already in hand. "Coming from Hayes's property. Heading toward the cattle." "How many?" "3, maybe 4. Can't be sure in the dark." Caleb was already moving, rousing the other hands, his mind racing through the implications. If Hayes was attempting to steal cattle now, in addition to everything else, it would be the final piece of evidence needed to expose his true character to the entire territory. They rode out together, moving carefully through the darkness, and found exactly what Tommy had described. 3 men working quickly to cut through fence wire, clearly intending to drive a portion of Caleb's herd across the property line and onto Hayes's land, likely to later claim the cattle had simply wandered onto property that rightfully belonged to him. "That's far enough!" Caleb called out. Rifle raised, his men fanning out around him with weapons of their own. The 3 men froze, and in the moonlight, Caleb recognized one of them immediately. "Marcus," he said, disbelief coloring his voice. "You work for me." His own ranch hand, one of the men Clara had spent months coaxing out of his sullen silence with warm meals and patient kindness, stood frozen with wire cutters still in hand, guilt and fear warring across his face. "Caleb, I can explain. You'd better explain fast, because right now this looks exactly like theft, and theft on this territory tends to end with a rope." "Hayes paid me," Marcus blurted, panic overriding whatever loyalty he might have felt toward the men now surrounding him. "Paid me good money to help with the fence, and before that with the barn." The confession hit like a physical blow. "You set the fire. It wasn't supposed to spread that far. Hayes said just enough to scare you, make you think twice about fighting the boundary claim. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, I swear it." Caleb's grip on his rifle tightened, rage and betrayal coursing through him in equal measure. "You could have killed someone. You could have killed me going in after that horse. I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry I didn't think it through. Hayes just kept offering more money and I—" Marcus's voice broke. "I've got debts, Caleb. Bad ones. He knew that. He used it." Clara, who had insisted on riding out despite Caleb's objections, stepped forward from behind the group of armed men. "Will you testify to that? In front of a judge that Walter Hayes paid you to burn the barn and steal cattle to strengthen his boundary claim?" Marcus looked between Caleb's furious expression and Clara's steady, determined one, clearly weighing the consequences of every possible choice available to him. "If I testify against Hayes, he'll ruin me. Make sure I never work in this territory again." "If you don't testify," Caleb said coldly, "I'm handing you over to the sheriff right now for arson and attempted cattle theft, and you can explain your loyalty to Walter Hayes from inside a jail cell." The threat, combined with the very real fear evident on the faces of his 2 accomplices, proved sufficient. "I'll testify," Marcus said quietly. "Everything. The fire, the fence, all of it." It was, Caleb realized, as they rode back toward the ranch with their prisoners in tow, exactly the break they desperately needed. But even as relief flooded through him, a new and more urgent fear took hold. Because if Walter Hayes was willing to pay for arson and theft to strengthen a fraudulent land claim, there was no telling what he might attempt once he learned his hired hands had turned against him, and no telling how far he might go to silence a witness before that witness ever made it to the courtroom. The court date was still 10 days away. 10 days during which Walter Hayes now had every reason to grow desperate and every reason to become considerably more dangerous than he'd already proven himself to be. Marcus and his 2 accomplices spent that night locked in the tack room under guard, and Caleb barely slept at all, sitting up at the kitchen table with Clara across from him, both of them turning over every possible move Walter Hayes might make next. "He'll know by morning," Clara said, wrapping her hands around a cup of coffee gone cold an hour ago. "Word travels fast in this valley. Someone will tell him his men didn't come back. Let him know. Let him spend every hour between now and the trial wondering exactly how much we've learned. That's what worries me." Clara's eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but sharp, alert thinking 3 steps ahead the way she always seemed to. A man who's already burned your barn and paid for cattle theft isn't going to sit quietly while his case falls apart. He's going to do something worse. She was right, though neither of them could have predicted exactly how quickly or how personally that something worse would arrive. It came the very next afternoon while Caleb was in town arranging for Marcus and the other two men to give sworn statements before the county sheriff. Clara stayed behind at the ranch finishing the mending pile that had grown steadily over the chaotic week when a buggy pulled into the yard that she didn't recognize. The man who stepped down from it was tall, well-dressed in a manner that seemed deliberately out of place for a ranching town, with pale eyes and a smile that made something instinctive in Clara's stomach clench tight with warning. "Miss Bennett," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "It's been a long time." Clara's blood went cold. "Edmund, you remember me. I'm flattered." Edmund Carver's smile widened, and Clara recognized in it the same calculated charm that had once fooled her 17-year-old self into believing she loved him. "You've led me quite a chase, Clara. Took considerable effort to track you all the way out to Wyoming. How did you find me?" "A mutual acquaintance mentioned a rancher out here was contesting a land dispute with quite an interesting witness list. Someone named Bennett." Edmund stepped closer, and Clara forced herself not to retreat, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. "Imagine my surprise when I learned it was you, living quite comfortably, I might add, in the home of a wealthy widower." "What do you want, Edmund?" "Want?" His eyebrows lifted in mock innocence. "I simply came to see how you were faring. We did part on such unpleasant terms." "You mean the terms where you tried to force me into marriage while my mother lay dying unless I paid for her care with the rest of my freedom?" Something flickered behind Edmund's charming mask, a flash of the cold cruelty Clara remembered from those final terrible months of their engagement. "That's a rather ungenerous way to characterize things. It's an accurate way. Careful, Clara." His voice dropped, losing its performative warmth entirely. "I understand you have a court appearance coming soon. Testifying against Walter Hayes, is that right?" "Interesting man, Hayes. We spoke just yesterday as it happens." Clara's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "You spoke with Walter Hayes. He was very interested to learn about your history. Very interested indeed." Edmund's smile turned sharp poisonous. "I imagine a judge would find it quite relevant, wouldn't he? Learning that the woman testifying against Mr. Hayes has her own history of broken engagements, unstable behavior running from town to town whenever things become inconvenient. That's not what happened, and you know it. I know what I choose to remember, and I know what I'm prepared to say under oath should Mr. Hayes's lawyer decide to call me as a character witness." Edmund replaced his hat, satisfaction radiating from every line of his posture. "Rather convenient, isn't it, how these things work out? Mr. Hayes was quite generous in discussing compensation for my testimony." "You'd lie under oath." "I'd share my perspective, Clara. Perspectives can differ." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her with an expression of cold, calculating cruelty. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to convince Mr. Whitmore to reconsider his position on the boundary dispute. I imagine Mr. Hayes would be considerably less interested in my testimony if the lawsuit simply disappeared. You're asking me to convince Caleb to give up 200 acres of his family's land just to keep you from lying about me in court." "I'm suggesting it might be the simpler solution for everyone involved." Clara's hands trembled with barely controlled fury. "Get off this property, Edmund. As you wish." He climbed back into his buggy unbothered, savoring every second of her obvious distress. "Do think about what I've said, Clara. It would be such a shame for that judge to hear the whole unfortunate truth about your character right before he decides who's telling the truth about a boundary line." He rode off, leaving Clara standing frozen in the yard, her whole body shaking with a mixture of fury and fear so profound it nearly buckled her knees. She didn't tell Caleb immediately. She told herself it was because she needed time to think clearly, to determine the best way to handle the threat without giving Edmund the satisfaction of watching Caleb's reaction. But some smaller, more honest part of her recognized the real reason. She was terrified that if Caleb heard the full extent of Edmund's threats, if he understood exactly how ugly this could become in that courtroom, He might start to wonder whether keeping her around was worth the cost to his family's legacy. She was wrong about him, though it would take a genuine crisis for her to fully understand just how wrong. Caleb noticed something was different the moment he returned from town, though it took him until dinner to fully identify what had changed. Clara moved through the kitchen with a careful, deliberate composure that felt performed rather than natural. Her smiles a fraction too quick, her laughter a fraction too bright. "Something happened while I was gone," he finally asked once the ranch hands had cleared out and they were alone at the table. "Nothing important." "Clara, it's nothing, Caleb, truly." She stood gathering dishes with unnecessary urgency. "How did it go with the sheriff? Did Marcus give his statement?" Caleb studied her for a long moment, recognizing the deflection for exactly what it was, having watched her deploy similar tactics against her own grief often enough to know the pattern. "Clara, whatever it is, I'd rather hear it from you than piece it together later and wonder why you didn't trust me enough to tell me." Something in his voice must have reached her, because her shoulders slumped slightly, the careful composure finally cracking. "Edmund came here today." Caleb's entire body went rigid. "Edmund, your former fiancé. He's working with Walter Hayes now. Or Hayes is paying him more accurately. He threatened to testify against my character to feed Hayes's lawyer whatever twisted version of our engagement he thinks will do the most damage." Clara's hands twisted together in her lap. "Unless I convince you to drop the Boundary lawsuit entirely." Fury rose in Caleb's chest, immediate and consuming, but he forced himself to keep his voice level, focused entirely on her rather than on the growing list of people he wanted to personally throttle. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to leave. But Caleb, if he testifies, if he says even half of what I know he's capable of saying, it could destroy any credibility I have in that courtroom. It could hurt your case." "Let him testify." Clara looked up, startled. "Did you hear what I just said?" "I heard every word. And I'm telling you, let him testify. Let him say whatever poisonous nonsense he wants." Caleb reached across the table, taking her trembling hands in his. "Clara, we have Judge Harmon's sworn testimony. We have the original survey documents verified and witnessed 30 years ago. We have Marcus's confession about the arson and the cattle theft directly implicating Walter Hayes in criminal activity. A bitter ex-fiancé making unsubstantiated accusations about your character isn't going to outweigh actual evidence. You don't know that. I know that any judge worth his position will recognize a coordinated smear campaign when he sees one. And I know that I am not going to let you sacrifice yourself, your reputation, or your peace of mind, just to protect 200 acres of grazing land. It's not just grazing land, Caleb. It's your family's legacy. Your father's legacy. My father's legacy isn't a piece of dirt, Clara. It's the way he taught me to treat people, to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, to never let fear or convenience compromise my character. Caleb's voice grew fierce with conviction. He would be ashamed of me if I let a man like Walter Hayes intimidate me into sacrificing you to save some acreage. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Though these felt different from the exhausted, fearful tears she'd cried so often over the past weeks, these carried something like disbelieving hope. "You really mean that?" "Every word." She came around the table and into his arms, and Caleb held her tight, wishing he could somehow absorb every fear and threat directed at her, wishing he could simply make the entire ugly situation disappear through sheer force of will. He couldn't, of course. But he could make absolutely certain that whatever came next, Clara would never have to face it alone. 5 days before the scheduled court date, Walter Hayes made his most aggressive move yet. Caleb learned about it from the county sheriff himself, who rode out to the ranch personally, his expression grim as he dismounted. "Whitmore, we've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" "Marcus Delaney's dead." The words hit like a physical blow. Dead. He was fine yesterday, giving his statement. Found him this morning hanging in his cell. Deputy on duty swears he checked on him regular through the night, says everything looked normal, right up until he found him at dawn. The sheriff's weathered face carried the particular exhaustion of a man who suspected far more than he could prove. Coroner's calling it suicide. Guilt over what he'd done, maybe fear of prison. You don't believe that. I believe a man about to testify against Walter Hayes turning up dead the week before trial is one hell of a coincidence. The sheriff's voice dropped lower. But I've got no evidence of foul play. No witnesses. Nothing but a bad feeling, and 30 years of watching men like Hayes get away with things because they're always careful enough to keep their hands clean. Caleb felt sick. What about the other two men? The ones with him. Both released on bail this morning. Both gone by noon. Skipped town entirely best anyone can tell. Someone paid them to disappear. Can't prove that either. The sheriff's expression carried genuine regret. I'm sorry, Whitmore. Without Marcus's testimony, without the other two corroborating it, you're back to just the survey documents and Judge Harmon's word against whatever Hayes's lawyer manages to construct. After the sheriff left, Caleb found Clara in the garden, and the moment she saw his face, she knew something catastrophic had happened. Tell me, she said simply. He told her everything. Marcus's death, the convenient disappearance of the other witnesses, the mounting certainty that Walter Hayes was capable of far darker things than land fraud and arson. He killed him, Clara said, her voice hollow with horrified understanding. To keep him from testifying. We can't prove that. But you believe it. I believe it completely. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. Which means we're dealing with a man who's already crossed the line into murder to protect his interests. Which means the danger to both of us just became considerably more real. The implications settled over them both like a physical weight. The abstract threat of financial ruin suddenly transformed into something far more visceral and immediate. What do we do now? Clara asked. We fight harder. We make sure every piece of evidence we still have is airtight. And... Caleb hesitated. I want you to consider staying somewhere else until the trial concludes. Somewhere Walter Hayes can't easily reach. Absolutely not. Clara, if he's willing to kill a witness, then he might come after me, regardless of where I'm hiding, because at this point, I already know too much. Clara's voice carried a steel Caleb hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. I'm not running, Caleb. I ran once already from Edmund, from everything familiar. And I promised myself I would never again let fear dictate my choices. I'm staying here beside you until this is finished. Caleb wanted desperately to argue, to insist on her safety, even if it meant temporarily sacrificing her presence, but the fierce determination in her eyes told him clearly that this particular battle was already lost. Then we're careful, he said instead. No one goes anywhere alone. The men keep watch in shifts, day and night, until this trial is behind us. Agreed. They spent the following days in a state of tense, careful vigilance, every unfamiliar sound outside the house sending a spike of adrenaline through both their systems. Every visitor to the ranch scrutinized with suspicion, until proven harmless. The strain began showing on both of them, shadows deepening beneath their eyes. Conversations growing shorter and more clipped, the easy warmth that had developed between them over the past months compressed under the weight of constant low-grade fear. It was during this fragile, exhausted period that the second devastating blow arrived. Clara received the letter on a Tuesday afternoon delivered by the same nervous courier who'd brought news of the court date weeks before. She recognized the elegant, deliberate handwriting immediately, and her stomach dropped before she'd even broken the seal. Edmund's letter was brief, devastatingly precise in its cruelty. I've reconsidered our previous conversation, Clara. Given recent developments, I'm sure you've heard about poor Mr. Delaney's unfortunate demise. I think it wise to remind you what's truly at stake here. Mr. Hayes has been most generous in compensating my cooperation. I intend to testify at the upcoming trial regarding your history of instability and manipulation. Unless, of course, you reconsider my earlier proposal. Convince Mr. Whitmore to settle the boundary dispute favorably toward Mr. Hayes, and I'll happily discover that my memory of our engagement has grown considerably kinder. The choice, as always, remains entirely yours. Clara read the letter 3 times before the full weight of its implications settled fully into her chest. Edmund wasn't simply threatening her reputation anymore. He was implicitly connecting himself to Marcus's death, suggesting without directly stating it that continued resistance might carry consequences considerably more severe than damaged credibility in a courtroom. She found Caleb in the barn's charred remains, surveying the damage with Otis, discussing plans for rebuilding once the immediate crisis had passed. Caleb. Her voice must have carried something urgent because he turned immediately, his expression sharpening at whatever he saw in her face. What happened? She handed him the letter without speaking, watching his expression transform from confusion to fury to something colder and more dangerous as he processed the implicit threat woven through Edmund's carefully chosen words. "He's threatening your life," Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. "Suggesting Marcus's death should serve as a warning. That's how I read it, too. This ends now." Caleb crumpled the letter in his fist. "I'm going to the sheriff. This is evidence, Clara. Direct evidence of intimidation possibly connected to a murder investigation." "Caleb, wait." Clara caught his arm before he could storm off toward his horse. "If we go to the sheriff now before the trial, Hayes and Edmund will simply claim the letters a fabrication that we manufactured evidence to discredit them. We need this to come out at the trial itself in front of the judge, where it can't be dismissed as convenient timing." "You want to wait?" "Knowing what these men are capable of, I want to win Caleb, completely and permanently, in a way that ensures neither of them can threaten us again once this is finished." Clara's voice carried a fierce, calculating determination that reminded Caleb once again of exactly how much strength lived beneath her gentle exterior. "We present everything at once. The survey documents, Judge Harmon's testimony, Marcus's original statement to the sheriff before his death, and now this letter, proving a clear pattern of intimidation and coercion. And if they come after you again before the trial, then we'll be ready." Caleb studied her for a long moment, torn between his instinct to protect her at any cost and his growing recognition that Clara Bennett was not a woman who needed protecting so much as a partner who deserved to be trusted with the fight. "All right," he finally said. "We wait, but you're not leaving my sight until this trial concludes, not for any reason. I wouldn't have it any other way." The days leading up to the trial passed in a blur of careful preparation and mounting tension. Caleb's lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman from Cheyenne named Sarah Whitfield, who'd taken the case despite Walter Hayes's considerable local influence, reviewed every piece of evidence with meticulous attention. "This letter," she said, examining Edmund's carefully worded threat during their final preparation meeting, "is exactly the kind of thing that could turn this entire case. Combined with Judge Harmon's testimony and the original survey, we're not just proving Hayes wrong about the boundary. We're exposing a coordinated campaign of intimidation possibly extending to murder." "Can we prove the connection to Marcus's death?" Caleb asked. "Not conclusively, but we don't need to prove murder to establish a pattern of witness intimidation, which alone should be enough to seriously damage Hayes's credibility with any reasonable judge." Whitfield's sharp eyes moved to Clara. "Miss Bennett, I need you prepared for aggressive questioning about your engagement to Mr. Carver. They will try to paint you as unstable, manipulative, potentially the same accusations Carver's letter threatens directly." "I understand. The truth is your strongest defense. Answer honestly without defensiveness and let the pattern of intimidation speak for itself." A judge who sees a woman calmly, honestly describing an abusive engagement, contrasted against a man whose testimony was purchased through explicit threats, will draw his own conclusions. Clara nodded, though Caleb could see the tension coiled tight beneath her composed exterior. That night, unable to sleep, despite bone-deep exhaustion, they sat together on the porch steps, where so much of their relationship had already unfolded. Confessions of grief, first admissions of feeling promises made in the darkness that neither of them had fully understood the weight of at the time. "Are you scared?" Clara asked quietly. "Terrified," Caleb admitted. "Not of losing the land, of losing you somehow in all of this, of Hayes or Carver finding some way to hurt you that we haven't anticipated. I'm scared too." Clara leaned into him, seeking warmth against the cool night air, and the colder fear coiled in both their chests. But I keep thinking about something my mother used to say. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Clara. It's choosing to act rightly despite the fear, because the alternative is letting fear win, and fear never actually protects you from anything. It just steals your life a little at a time. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was. Clara's voice carried a mixture of grief and warmth. I think she would have liked you, Caleb. I think she would have liked the way you've fought for this land, for your family's legacy, without ever losing sight of what actually matters. And what's that? People. Doing right by the people you love, even when it costs you something significant. Clara looked up at him, moonlight catching the fierce determination in her eyes. Whatever happens in that courtroom tomorrow, I need you to know that being here with you, choosing to fight instead of running, it's already been worth every difficulty we've faced. Caleb kissed her, then slow and deliberate, trying to communicate through touch, everything he struggled to express through words. Gratitude. Fierce, protective love. A certainty that had grown steadily since that first day on the train platform when he'd expected a stranger, and found instead the woman who would eventually crack open a heart he'd believed permanently sealed. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said against her lips, we face it together. Together, she agreed. Neither of them slept much that night, both too aware of the enormous stakes awaiting them. Come morning, both silently praying that their careful preparation would prove sufficient against a man who'd already demonstrated he was capable of intimidation, sabotage, and possibly murder to achieve his goals. The Cheyenne courthouse was already crowded by the time Caleb and Clara arrived, word of the increasingly dramatic dispute having spread throughout the territory. Walter Hayes sat at the opposing table, with his lawyer looking entirely too confident for a man whose case Caleb desperately hoped was about to collapse spectacularly. Edmund Carver sat in the gallery, and his eyes met Clara's with cold, calculating satisfaction that made Caleb's protective instincts flare dangerously. Ignore him, Whitfield murmured. Focus on the judge, on presenting the truth clearly and calmly. Let the evidence speak. Judge Thaddeus Reed, a stern man with sharp, observant eyes, called the proceedings to order, and Caleb felt Clara's hand find his beneath the table, gripping tight. Walter Hayes's lawyer opened first, presenting the boundary dispute with practiced confidence, introducing documents that supposedly proved the original survey had been conducted incorrectly. Caleb watched Judge Reed's expression remain carefully neutral, giving nothing away, as the fraudulent claims were laid out before him. Then it was Whitfield's turn. She introduced the original survey documents first, watching Judge Reed's eyebrows rise slightly at their age and evident authenticity. Then came Judge Harmon's testimony, delivered via sworn affidavit, due to his advanced age, describing in precise detail his personal witnessing of the original boundary survey 30 years prior. Objection, Hayes's lawyer interjected. This so-called affidavit could easily be fabricated. Your Honor. Whitfield responded smoothly. Judge Harmon remains a respected member of this territory's legal community. I have no doubt the court can verify his signature and reputation without difficulty. Judge Reed nodded slowly, making a note, and Caleb felt a small flicker of hope ignite in his chest. Then Whitfield produced Marcus Delaney's original statement to the sheriff describing the arson and cattle theft orchestrated at Walter Hayes's direction. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Hayes's confident expression finally cracked, replaced by something considerably more alarmed. Your Honor, his lawyer protested. This statement was made by a man who subsequently died under suspicious circumstances. It cannot be verified or cross-examined. Precisely the point I intend to make, Whitfield replied coolly. Mr. Delaney died the night before he was scheduled to give formal sworn testimony against Mr. Hayes. The timing raises serious questions this court cannot simply ignore. Judge Reed's expression darkened considerably, his sharp eyes moving toward Walter Hayes with new, unmistakable suspicion. And that, Whitfield continued, brings me to my final piece of evidence. She produced Edmund Carver's letter, reading it aloud in its entirety, every implicit threat and coercive suggestion laid bare before the entire courtroom. The gallery fell into stunned silence. "Your Honor," Whitfield said, "this letter demonstrates a clear documented pattern of intimidation directed at my client's witness, Miss Clara Bennett, explicitly connecting the threat to Mr. Delaney's recent suspicious death and explicitly offering to withhold false testimony in exchange for Mr. Whitmore abandoning his legitimate claim to his own family's land." Judge Reed's gaze swung sharply toward Edmund Carver, who had gone visibly pale in the gallery. "Mr. Carver," the judge said, his voice carrying dangerous authority, "you'll approach the bench immediately. I have several questions regarding this letter that I expect you to answer under oath right now in this courtroom." Edmund's composure crumbled entirely as he was called forward, and under Judge Reed's relentless, precise questioning, his carefully constructed story began falling apart within minutes. "You admit Walter Hayes offered you compensation for testimony regarding Miss Bennett's character?" "Yes, Your Honor, but—" "And you admit sending this letter explicitly connecting your continued silence to Mr. Whitmore abandoning his legal claim?" "I never intended any actual threat. I simply meant—" "The letter speaks quite clearly for itself, Mr. Carver. I find your testimony regarding Miss Bennett's character entirely compromised by this documented pattern of coercion and financial incentive." Judge Reed's cold gaze shifted toward Walter Hayes, who sat frozen, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Mr. Hayes, I believe this court requires considerably more explanation regarding your relationship with both Mr. Carver and the late Mr. Delaney." What followed was a rapid, humiliating unraveling of Walter Hayes's entire fraudulent scheme. Under increasingly pointed questioning, his own lawyer's objections growing weaker with each revelation, Hayes eventually admitted to paying both Edmund and the deceased Marcus Delaney, though he continued vehemently denying any involvement in Marcus's death itself. "Your Honor," Whitfield said once the damaging testimony had concluded, "given the overwhelming evidence of fraud, witness intimidation, and possible connection to a suspicious death, I respectfully request this court not only dismiss Mr. Hayes's boundary claim entirely, but refer this matter to the county prosecutor for full criminal investigation." Judge Reed's gavel came down with decisive finality. "This court finds entirely in favor of Mr. Whitmore. The boundary shall remain exactly as originally surveyed 30 years ago. Furthermore, given the disturbing evidence presented today, I am ordering an immediate criminal investigation into Mr. Hayes's conduct, including his connection to Marcus Delaney's death and the systematic intimidation of witnesses in this case." The courtroom erupted into stunned murmurs, and Caleb felt Clara's hand tighten around his. Both of them absorbing the overwhelming relief of victory alongside the sobering weight of everything it had taken to achieve it. Walter Hayes was led away by the county sheriff before the proceedings had even fully concluded, his lawyer already distancing himself from a client whose criminal exposure had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Edmund Carver fled the courtroom the moment he was dismissed, refusing to meet Clara's eyes, even once his own reputation now thoroughly permanently destroyed by his own admitted complicity. "It's over," Clara whispered, disbelief evident in her voice. "Caleb, it's actually over." "Not entirely," Caleb said, watching Walter Hayes disappear through the courthouse doors in handcuffs. "There's still the investigation into Marcus's death, still consequences to work through. But the land is safe, and you're safe, and I'm safe." Clara's eyes filled with tears of pure relief. "That's what matters most." Caleb pulled her into his arms right there in the crowded courtroom, uncaring of the curious stares from onlookers who'd witnessed the entire dramatic unraveling of Walter Hayes's scheme. "We did it," he murmured into her hair. "Together." "Together," she agreed, and for the first time in weeks, the word carried nothing but relief and hope, unburdened by fear of what might still be coming. But even as they stood together, celebrating their hard-won victory, neither of them could fully shake the unsettling knowledge that Walter Hayes, cornered and facing serious criminal charges, was exactly the kind of desperate, wounded animal capable of one final dangerous act of vengeance before the law could fully close in around him. The trial was over. The danger they would soon discover was not. The ride back to Red Hollow felt different than any ride Caleb had taken in 7 years. Lighter somehow, despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in his body. Clara sat close beside him in the wagon, her hand never leaving his, both of them quiet in the particular way people get after surviving something enormous together. "You're smiling," Clara said, eventually studying his face. "Didn't realize I still remembered how." "It looks good on you." "Feels good," Caleb admitted. "Feels like I can finally breathe again." They should have known better than to let their guard down so completely. Otis met them at the ranch gate, his expression tight with an urgency that immediately cut through their relief. "Boss, we got trouble." "Hayes is in custody, Otis. Whatever trouble you're thinking of, it's already handled." "Not that kind of trouble." Otis's weathered face carried genuine alarm. "Sheriff sent a rider out about an hour ago. Says Hayes made bail already. Some judge in the next county over, one he's apparently got history with, released him this afternoon, pending the criminal investigation." Caleb's stomach dropped. "That's not possible. He was just arrested." "Possible or not, he's out, and according to the sheriff, he rode straight out of Cheyenne looking like a man with nothing left to lose." Clara's grip on Caleb's hand tightened painfully. "He knows everything's over. His land claim, his reputation, probably his freedom eventually, once the investigation into Marcus's death concludes. Which makes him exactly the kind of desperate that gets people killed," Caleb finished grimly. "Sheriff's sending men to watch the property," Otis said. But he was clear that with Hayes out on bail and this whole territory still buzzing about the trial, resources are stretched thin tonight. Caleb was already moving toward the house, mind racing through defensive measures. "Get every hand armed and posted. Nobody sleeps tonight until we know exactly where Hayes is and what he's planning." "Already started, boss." The next several hours passed in a haze of tense preparation, men stationed at every approach to the property, lanterns extinguished to avoid providing easy targets. Clara insisting on staying close to Caleb, despite his repeated attempts to convince her to take shelter somewhere more protected. "If something happens, I want to be with you," she said simply, when he raised the argument for the 4th time. "Not hiding somewhere wondering if you're safe. We face the courtroom together. We'll face whatever comes next together, too." He didn't have the strength left to argue, not when some traitorous part of him agreed entirely with her reasoning. Midnight came and went without incident, and Caleb allowed himself the smallest sliver of hope that perhaps Hayes had simply fled the territory entirely, choosing self-preservation over vengeance. That hope died at approximately 2 in the morning when Tommy's frantic shout tore through the darkness. "Fire, fire at the eastern fence line!" Caleb was moving before he'd fully processed the words. Grabbing his rifle, Clara close behind him despite his instinctive urge to shield her from whatever danger awaited. They found the fence blazing along nearly 50 yards of dry wood flames, leaping high enough to illuminate the surrounding darkness in flickering orange light. And standing silhouetted against that hellish glow, unmistakable even from a distance, was Walter Hayes himself, a torch still burning in his hand. "Hayes!" Caleb's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. "Drop it, now!" Walter turned slowly, and even from a distance, Caleb could see the wild, unhinged quality that had replaced his usual calculated composure. This wasn't the confident, controlled man who'd smiled smugly outside the land office weeks ago. This was a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to protect except his own desperate rage. "You think a piece of paper in some judge's courtroom changes anything?" Walter's voice carried across the flames, ragged with fury. "That land should have been mine. My grandfather surveyed this whole valley before your father ever set foot here. That's not what any record shows, Walter. You know that. Records can be wrong. Records can be fixed." Walter's laugh sounded broken, unhinged. "I built an empire in this territory, Whitmore, and you and your little mail-order bride destroyed it in one afternoon. You destroyed it yourself the moment you decided fraud and murder were acceptable business strategies. I never touched Marcus Delaney." Something raw and dangerous entered Walter's voice. That was his own guilty conscience, nothing more. Convenient timing for a guilty conscience. Walter's grip tightened on the torch, and Caleb felt Clara go rigid beside him. Both of them recognizing simultaneously that they were dealing with a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Put the torch down, Hayes," Caleb said, forcing his voice into something calm, measured despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. "This ends now one way or another. Don't make it end with someone getting killed. Someone's already dying tonight, Whitmore." Walter's eyes, wild and desperate in the firelight, fixed on something behind Caleb, and too late Caleb registered the second figure emerging from the shadows near the barn's charred remains. "Caleb!" Clara's scream came a half-second before the gunshot. Everything happened impossibly fast after that. Caleb spun toward the sound saw, one of Walter's remaining hired men, raising a rifle. Felt Clara's body suddenly slamming into his own, knocking him sideways just as the shot cracked through the night air. He hit the ground hard, Clara's weight collapsing against him, and for one horrifying, endless moment, Caleb couldn't tell whose blood he was feeling, soak warm and terrible against his shirt. "Clara!" His voice came out strangled, barely recognizable even to himself. "Clara, look at me. She gasped, pain evident in every syllable. "I'm all right, I think. Just my shoulder." Relief and terror warred violently in his chest as he saw the dark stain spreading across her upper arm, the bullet having caught her shoulder rather than anything more immediately fatal. Though the amount of blood already soaking through her sleeve told him the wound was serious enough to require immediate attention. "You pushed me out of the way." His voice broke entirely. "You could have died. Would have been worth it." She managed even through obvious agony. "If it meant you survived." Around them, chaos had erupted. Otis and the other hands returning fire. Walter Hayes's remaining accomplice fleeing into the darkness rather than face armed resistance. Walter himself frozen at the edge of the burning fence line, apparently stunned by the sudden violence his own desperate scheme had unleashed. "Drop your weapon!" Otis's voice thundered across the yard rifle trained directly on Walter. "Right now, or I swear to God!" Walter's torch fell from his trembling hand, extinguishing in the dirt, and something in his posture crumpled entirely, the last vestiges of his defiant fury collapsing into hollow, exhausted defeat. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said, his voice suddenly small, disbelieving. "None of it was supposed to happen like this." But Caleb barely registered Walter's collapse, his entire focus consumed by Clara, whose face had gone alarmingly pale, whose breathing had grown shallow and labored, despite her attempts to reassure him. "Someone get Doc Ellison!" Caleb's voice tore raw from his throat. "Now Tommy ride like hell!" The boy was already sprinting toward the horses, disappearing into the darkness, with the kind of desperate speed that came from genuine fear. "Stay with me," Caleb said, pressing his hands against Clara's wound, trying to slow the bleeding with whatever pressure he could manage. "Clara, stay with me. Do you hear me? You don't get to leave me now. Not after everything." "Not planning on it," Clara whispered, though her voice had grown alarmingly faint. "Just need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me this doesn't make you close yourself off again. Whatever happens tonight, promise me you won't retreat back into that locked room in your heart. Nothing's happening tonight except you getting better." Caleb's voice cracked with desperate conviction. "I refuse to accept any other outcome. Do you understand me? I already buried the people I love once. I'm not doing it again." Clara's eyes fluttered, consciousness clearly fighting against the shock and blood loss overwhelming her system, and Caleb held her tighter, willing every ounce of strength he possessed into keeping her present, keeping her fighting. "Caleb." Her voice had dropped to barely a whisper. "I need you to know. Don't." His voice broke entirely. "Don't say it like it's a goodbye, Clara. Say it to me tomorrow when you're healed, when we're sitting on that porch watching the sunset like we always do. Say it then." Her eyes met his, glazed with pain, but still fiercely, stubbornly alive. "All right," she whispered. "Tomorrow, then." But her eyes closed anyway, her body finally succumbing to shock, and Caleb's entire world narrowed down to the terrifying rhythm of her shallow breathing, and the desperate hope that Doc Ellison would arrive before that rhythm faltered entirely. The next several hours blurred together in a haze of terror and desperate action. Doc Ellison arrived within 30 agonizing minutes, immediately setting to work extracting the bullet from Clara's shoulder, while Caleb paced outside the makeshift surgery they'd established in the ranch house's main bedroom. Otis, in the other hands, maintaining tense, watchful guard against any further threat from Walter Hayes's direction. Walter himself sat bound and guarded in the barn's remaining intact section, awaiting the sheriff's arrival. His earlier desperate fury replaced entirely by hollow, defeated silence. "She's lost a fair amount of blood," Doc Ellison said, finally emerging from the bedroom, looking grim but not entirely without hope. "Bullet missed anything vital, thank God, but she's weak, and the next 24 hours will tell us a great deal about her recovery." "Can I see her?" "Briefly. She needs rest more than anything else right now." Caleb entered the room to find Clara pale against the pillows. Her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but steady in a way that offered the smallest measure of comfort. He sat beside the bed, taking her uninjured hand in both of his, and simply stayed there, watching the rise and fall of her chest, praying with an intensity he hadn't felt since those desperate days searching for Sarah and Thomas in the aftermath of that terrible storm. He refused to leave her side for the rest of that night, dozing fitfully in a chair beside her bed, waking at every small sound or shift in her breathing, terrified of a repeat of the loss that had already devastated him once. Dawn broke gray and quiet over the ranch, and it was the gentle pressure of Clara's fingers tightening around his own that finally pulled Caleb from an exhausted, restless half-sleep. "Caleb," she murmured, her voice weak but unmistakably alert. "I'm here." He was instantly awake, leaning forward, searching her face for any sign of deterioration. "I'm right here, Clara." "Still here myself, apparently." A weak, exhausted smile touched her lips. "Guess I owe you that conversation about tomorrow." Relief crashed through him so powerfully that for a moment he couldn't speak at all, simply pressing his forehead against her uninjured hand, allowing himself finally to release the terror he'd been holding since the moment that gunshot had cracked through the darkness. "Don't ever do that again," he finally managed. "Don't ever put yourself between me and a bullet again." "Can't promise that." Clara's voice, though weak, carried unmistakable stubbornness. "I meant what I said last night, Caleb. It would have been worth it." "It wouldn't have been worth it to me. Losing you would have destroyed whatever's left of me, Clara. Completely and permanently, in a way I don't think I'd ever recover from." Something in Clara's expression softened tears gathering in her eyes, despite her obvious exhaustion. "Then I suppose we'll both simply have to be more careful about staying alive for each other. I intend to hold you to that." Doc Ellison checked on her throughout that day, cautiously optimistic about her recovery, though he insisted on complete bed rest for at least a week longer if any signs of infection developed. Caleb barely left her side, managing the ranch's ongoing needs through hurried consultations with Otis, while refusing to be more than a few steps away from Clara's room at any given moment. Walter Hayes, meanwhile, was formally taken into custody by the sheriff later that morning. The attempted murder charges alongside the existing fraud and witness intimidation, ensuring he would face considerably more severe consequences than he'd likely anticipated when his desperate scheme began weeks earlier. "Confess to everything," the sheriff told Caleb once Hayes had been secured and transported toward the county jail. Marcus's death included. Apparently panicked when he learned Marcus intended to testify, arranged for one of his hired men to make it look like suicide. Whole thing's about as ugly as these situations get. Will he hang? Territory's justice tends to be swift with murder, especially premeditated murder connected to fraud and witness intimidation. I'd say the odds are considerable. The sheriff's expression carried grim satisfaction. Man had this valley believing he was respectable for 15 years. Took someone with real backbone finally standing up to expose exactly what he was capable of. Caleb thought of Clara still recovering in the next room and felt a fierce surge of protective pride entirely separate from the relief of justice finally being served. "She's the one who deserves the credit," he said quietly. Every step of the way, she refused to back down, even when backing down would have been so much easier. "Word around town says you two make quite the formidable pair." The sheriff's weathered face creased with something like genuine warmth. "Glad to see you finally found some happiness, Whitmore. This valley's watched you carry your grief alone long enough." After the sheriff departed, Caleb returned to Clara's bedside, finding her awake and attempting, despite Doc Ellison's explicit instructions, to sit up unassisted. "Absolutely not," he said gently, but firmly guiding her back against the pillows. "You heard the doctor. Bed rest." "I've been lying here for hours, Caleb. I'm going to lose my mind from boredom before this shoulder ever fully heals." "Then I'll keep you entertained." He settled into the chair beside her bed, taking her hand again. "Though I should warn you, my conversational skills have grown considerably rusty over the past 7 years of self-imposed isolation. I've noticed considerable improvement actually since a certain woman forced her way into your kitchen and refused to let you retreat back into silence." "Forced her way in, Seemed to recall you nearly missing your own train that day." Semantics. Clara's exhausted smile carried genuine warmth despite her obvious pain. "The outcome remains the same regardless of the particular sequence of events that led us here." They fell into comfortable, easy conversation, filling the hours of her recovery with stories from their respective pasts, memories of parents and siblings, long-lost tentative dreams about a future that suddenly miraculously felt considerably more possible than it had just months before. "What happens now?" Clara asked, eventually, her voice growing heavy with approaching sleep. "With the ranch, I mean. With everything." "We rebuild the barn properly this time. We continue the work you started in that garden, in that kitchen, turning this place back into an actual home, rather than just a house I happen to occupy." Caleb's thumb traced gentle patterns across the back of her hand. "And once you're fully healed, I intend to ask you something considerably more permanent than continued employment as my cook and housekeeper." Clara's eyes, heavy with exhaustion but sharp with sudden understanding, met his. "Caleb Whitmore, are you attempting to propose to me while I'm lying in bed recovering from a gunshot wound?" "I'm informing you of my intentions, Miss Bennett. The actual proposal will happen properly once you're strong enough to stand on your own 2 feet, and I've had adequate time to prepare something worthy of the occasion. I look forward to it then." Clara's eyes finally drifted closed, exhaustion overtaking her, despite her evident happiness. "Though for the record, I would have said yes, regardless of the proper circumstances." "Duly noted," Caleb whispered, watching her slip into peaceful sleep. Gratitude and love swelling in his chest, with an intensity that still occasionally caught him off guard. Still felt almost unbelievable after 7 years of believing himself permanently incapable of such feeling. Clara's recovery progressed steadily over the following 2 weeks, her strength gradually returning despite occasional setbacks that reminded them both how close they'd come to losing everything that terrible night. The ranch hands took turns checking on her throughout each day, Tommy in particular developing an almost fierce protective loyalty toward the woman who'd shown him such consistent kindness since her arrival. "Brought you something, ma'am," he said one afternoon, presenting Clara with a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd clearly gathered with considerable care. "Ain't much, but the doc says flowers help folks feel better while they're mending." "They're beautiful, Tommy. Thank you." The boy flushed with pleased embarrassment before hurrying back to his chores, and Clara watched him go with an expression of genuine warmth. "You've built quite a family here," she observed to Caleb, who'd entered just in time to witness the exchange. "Whether you intended to or not, wasn't intentional, I promise you. Otis has worked this land since before I was born. Tommy showed up 3 years ago, practically starving, looking for any work he could find. The others drifted in over the years, each with their own story." Caleb settled into his customary chair beside her bed. "Never really thought about it as family until you pointed it out just now." "Family isn't always the people you're born connected to," Clara said softly. "Sometimes it's the people who choose to stay who show up for each other regardless of blood or obligation. Is that how you're thinking of us, family? I'm hoping we might eventually become something even more specific than that." Clara's teasing smile carried unmistakable warmth. "Though I understand a certain someone insists on waiting for proper circumstances before making any formal declarations. A certain someone happens to be planning something considerably more thoughtful than a hasty proposal delivered beside a sickbed. I look forward to witnessing this apparently elaborate scheme." True to his word, Caleb spent the following days quietly preparing and enlisting Otis's help in restoring the small garden gazebo that had sat neglected since before Sarah's death, the same structure where he'd once proposed to his first wife, nearly a decade earlier. He recognized the significance of the choice, understood. It required careful consideration about honoring his past without allowing it to overshadow his present. When he finally discussed it with Clara, during one of her increasingly frequent walks around the property, as her strength returned, her response settled any remaining uncertainty he carried. "I think it's beautiful," she said, examining the gazebo's freshly repaired latticework, the climbing roses Caleb had transplanted from elsewhere on the property. Choosing a place that already holds meaning for you, rather than pretending your past simply doesn't exist. That feels honest, Caleb. Honoring what came before while still building something new. "You're certain I don't want you feeling like you're living in Sarah's shadow?" "I'm not living in her shadow. I'm walking alongside the memory of her in a place clearly built with love, understanding that her presence in your life doesn't diminish whatever we're building together." Clara's hand found his squeezing gently. "Grief and love aren't opposites, Caleb. Sometimes they're simply different rooms in the same house." 3 weeks after the shooting, once Doc Ellison had finally reluctantly cleared Clara for normal activity, Caleb led her toward that same gazebo as the sun began its slow descent toward the western ridge, painting the sky in the same fiery colors that had accompanied so many of their most significant conversations. "What's this about?" Clara asked, though her knowing smile suggested she'd already guessed. "I believe I mentioned something about proper circumstances." Caleb guided her toward the gazebo's center, where he'd carefully arranged wildflowers reminiscent of the ones Tommy had brought her during her recovery. "I wanted to do this properly, thoughtfully, in a place that means something." "Caleb, let me finish, please. I've been rehearsing this for 3 days, and I'm liable to forget everything if you interrupt me now." Clara's laugh carried a genuine warmth, despite the emotion clearly building behind her eyes. "Please continue." Caleb took a steadying breath, taking both her hands in his. 7 years ago, I buried my heart alongside my wife and brother, convinced I was protecting myself from ever experiencing that particular devastation again. I built walls so thick, I genuinely believed nothing could breach them. His voice grew rough with emotion. Then a train arrived carrying a woman I never asked for, never expected, and never once considered might completely dismantle everything I thought I understood about my own capacity for love. Tears gathered in Clara's eyes, though her expression remained fiercely attentive. "You taught me that grief and love aren't opposing forces, Clara. That my heart could hold space for everything I've lost while still making room for everything I might yet gain. You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but choosing to act rightly despite it." And somewhere between that first difficult conversation on the train platform and this moment right now, you became the reason I finally remembered how to actually live, rather than simply survive. He lowered himself to one knee, watching Clara's hand fly to her mouth, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "Clara Bennett, will you marry me? Not because you have nowhere else to go, not out of obligation or convenience, but because I genuinely cannot imagine building any future that doesn't include you standing beside me." "Yes," Clara whispered, then louder, more certain, "Yes, Caleb, 1,000 times yes." He rose to meet her, sliding a ring onto her trembling finger, his mother's ring carefully preserved and recently resized to fit Clara's hand, before pulling her into a kiss that carried every ounce of relief, gratitude, and fierce, hard-won love that had grown between them since that fateful day at the train station. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. Completely. Irrevocably. In ways I genuinely believed myself incapable of feeling ever again. "I love you too," Clara replied, laughing through her tears. "Enough to risk everything, including apparently my own safety, just to ensure we'd have this moment together." They stood together in that gazebo as the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, the sky darkening into the same deep purple that had witnessed so many of their most vulnerable, transformative conversations. Both of them finally completely certain that whatever challenges remained ahead, they would face them together as genuine partners, rather than two wounded people simply seeking temporary shelter from their respective griefs. But even as they celebrated this hard-won happiness, neither of them could have anticipated how thoroughly their story would soon become known throughout the entire territory, nor how the aftermath of Walter Hayes's trial and subsequent conviction would ripple through Red Hollow Valley in ways that would test their partnership, even as it cemented their standing within the community they'd fought so desperately to protect. Word of the engagement spread through Red Hollow faster than any of Walter Hayes's rumors ever had, and for once, Caleb found himself grateful for the town's insatiable appetite for gossip. Mrs. Pruitt cried when she heard insisting on hosting a small celebration at the boarding house. Even Mrs. Hutchins, Walter's cousin, who'd spread so much venom about Clara's character months earlier, found herself quietly, awkwardly congratulating them at the general store, unable to sustain her earlier hostility in the face of everything that had come to light. Guess she figures it's easier to change her tune than admit she was helping a fraud and a murderer smear an innocent woman, Otis observed dryly, watching the exchange from across the street. People believe what's convenient, Clara said, though there was no bitterness in her voice anymore, only the calm certainty of someone who no longer needed the town's approval to know her own worth. I stopped needing her good opinion the moment Judge Reed read that verdict. But not everyone in Red Hollow Valley had moved past the events of the past months so easily, and the first real test of their newfound happiness arrived less than a week after the proposal, in the form of a letter from the county prosecutor requesting Caleb and Clara's presence at Walter Hayes's sentencing hearing. "Do we have to go?" Clara asked, unable to fully hide her reluctance. "I've testified once already. I've relived that entire ordeal in front of a judge and a courtroom full of strangers." "We don't have to," Caleb said carefully. "But I think we should. For Marcus, if nothing else. Someone should stand there and make sure the court remembers he was a real person, not just a name on a case file." Clara considered this, something in her expression softening with understanding. "You're right. Of course you're right." The sentencing hearing, held 2 weeks later in the same Cheyenne courthouse where they'd fought so desperately for justice, proved considerably shorter than the original trial. Walter Hayes, stripped of his earlier arrogance, sat pale and diminished at the defendant's table, his once impeccable appearance now haggard and unkempt. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Reed said, his voice carrying the particular gravity reserved for moments of genuine consequence. "You stand convicted of fraud, arson, witness, intimidation, attempted murder, and conspiracy in connection with the death of Marcus Delaney. This court has reviewed the evidence extensively and finds no mitigating circumstances sufficient to warrant leniency." The sentence, when it came, was severe decades of imprisonment that would likely see Walter Hayes spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars, his once considerable ranch and holdings seized to pay restitution to those he'd defrauded and harmed. Edmund Carver, though not facing criminal charges himself, found his own reputation permanently destroyed by his admitted complicity, eventually leaving the territory entirely under a cloud of disgrace that followed him, regardless of where he attempted to rebuild his life. "It's finished," Clara said quietly, once the proceedings had concluded and they stood outside the courthouse in the crisp autumn air. "Truly completely finished." "Finished," Caleb agreed, pulling her close. "Now we get to actually start living." The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a crisp October afternoon, when the aspens had turned brilliant gold against the darkening pine of the surrounding mountains. Clara had wanted something simple, intimate, and Caleb had readily agreed, both of them having had quite enough drama and spectacle to last several lifetimes. Reverend Michaels, the same elderly minister who testified so crucially on their behalf months earlier, presided over the ceremony held in the same garden where Caleb had proposed the gazebo, now decorated with autumn wildflowers and ribbons that Clara had spent weeks preparing with meticulous, joyful attention. "Never thought I'd see this day," Otis muttered to Tommy. Both men dressed in their best clothes, looking distinctly uncomfortable in collars considerably stiffer than their usual work attire. Boss finally letting himself be happy again. "Ma'am deserves it too," Tommy said, watching Clara emerge from the house in a simple ivory dress her dark blonde hair adorned with the same wildflowers Tommy had once brought her during her recovery. After everything she's been through, Caleb watched her approach, and something in his chest swelled with an emotion so profound it nearly stole his breath entirely. 7 years of careful, deliberate isolation, and here he stood about to marry a woman who'd arrived on his doorstep with nothing but a single suitcase and an unshakable determination to build something better than what circumstance had handed her. "You look terrified," Clara whispered, taking her place beside him, her eyes sparkling with amused affection. "Terrified of my own happiness, maybe," Caleb admitted quietly. "Keep waiting for something to go wrong." "Nothing's going wrong today, Caleb Whitmore. Today is simply the beginning of everything we fought so hard to earn." Reverend Michaels cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the ceremony, and as he began speaking the familiar words that would bind them together permanently, Caleb found himself thinking not of loss, not of grief, not of the 7 long years he'd spent believing himself incapable of this particular kind of joy, but simply of the woman standing before him, whose courage and stubborn hope had somehow miraculously taught him how to live again. When Reverend Michaels finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering of ranch hands and townspeople erupted into genuine heartfelt celebration, and Caleb kissed his bride beneath the golden aspens with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, permanent and unshakable, in a way nothing had felt in longer than he cared to remember. The months that followed brought a kind of quiet, steady happiness that Caleb had genuinely believed himself permanently excluded from experiencing. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, the rebuilt barn standing sturdier than the original. The garden Clara had first coaxed back to life, now providing more than enough vegetables to feed the entire household through the approaching winter. Word of their story had spread throughout the territory, transforming them somewhat to their mutual embarrassment into something of local legend: the widower who'd sworn off love entirely, and the mail-order bride who'd refused to be sent away together, exposing a dangerous fraud that had threatened the entire valley's sense of security and justice. "Newspaper wants to interview us," Clara said one evening, reading through a letter that had arrived from a Cheyenne publication eager to document their dramatic story. "Apparently, our particular brand of scandal makes for excellent reading. Tell them no." "I already did. Politely, of course." Clara set the letter aside, settling onto the porch beside him, as the sun began its familiar descent toward the western ridge. "Some things belong to us alone, I think. Not for public consumption." "Agreed completely." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sky shift through its familiar progression of colors, and Caleb found himself thinking, as he often did during these quiet evening moments, about how dramatically his life had transformed since that afternoon at the train station, when he'd arrived with nothing but a return ticket and a heart determined to remain permanently closed. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said eventually, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than her usual playful teasing. "Anything." "Do you regret it?" "Any of it. The danger, the fear, everything." "Walter Hayes and Edmund put us through." Caleb considered the question seriously, understanding it deserved genuine reflection rather than an automatic reassurance. "I regret that Marcus died," he said slowly. "I regret that you were shot, that you carry a scar now, because you chose to protect me instead of yourself. Those things I'll always carry with some measure of grief and guilt, regardless of how thoroughly justice was eventually served. But no, I don't regret any of it fundamentally, because everything that happened led directly to this moment, sitting here with you, finally understanding what it means to actually live, rather than simply survive." He took her hand, pressing a gentle kiss against the scar still visible on her shoulder, a permanent reminder of everything they'd overcome together. "I spent 7 years believing love was simply another mechanism for eventual inevitable loss. You taught me it could be something else entirely. Something worth every risk, every fear, every difficult moment we had to fight through to reach this particular sunset." Clara's eyes filled with tears, though these carried nothing but profound happiness. "That might be the most eloquent thing you've ever said to me, Caleb Whitmore. Don't get used to it. I've got a reputation for gruff silence to maintain." Her laughter carried across the yard, warm and genuine, and Caleb felt his own smile spreading in response, still occasionally amazed by how naturally joy had returned to occupy space in a heart he'd once believed permanently sealed against such possibilities. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Red Hollow Valley in the kind of heavy, persistent snow that had once filled Caleb with dread memories of another winter storm, still capable of stealing his breath with sudden, unexpected grief. But this winter felt different, transformed by Clara's steady presence beside him, by the warm lamplight filling their kitchen each evening, by the particular comfort of no longer facing the season's harsh isolation entirely alone. "You're doing that thing again," Clara observed one evening, watching him stare out the frost-covered window with an expression she'd learned to recognize over their months together. "What thing?" "Getting lost somewhere in your memories. It's all right, you know. You don't have to hide it from me." Caleb turned from the window, studying his wife's understanding expression with quiet gratitude. Just thinking about Sarah and Thomas, about how different this winter feels compared to everyone before it. Different how? Less lonely. He crossed the room, settling beside her near the fireplace's steady warmth. "I used to dread winter more than any other season. Too much time alone with my thoughts, too many reminders of what I'd lost during that particular kind of storm. And now I find myself almost looking forward to these long evenings. Sitting here with you watching the snow fall outside while we're warm and safe inside." Caleb's arm settled around her shoulders, careful of the healing wound, still occasionally tender beneath her dress. "You transformed something I'd learned to dread into something I actually treasure." Clara leaned into his embrace, resting her head against his shoulder with the easy comfort of someone who'd finally found genuine safety after years of upheaval and loss. "I think Sarah and Thomas would be glad, you know, watching you find this kind of peace again." "I think so too," Caleb admitted quietly. "Took me a long time to believe that loving you didn't somehow betray their memory. You helped me understand my heart was simply big enough to hold both kinds of love simultaneously. Grief and joy occupying the same space." "Exactly that." They sat together through the deepening evening, watching snow accumulate steadily outside their window. Both of them finally completely at peace with a present that honored their respective pasts, without allowing that history to overshadow the genuine happiness they'd built together. Spring arrived with its usual gradual thaw, transforming Red Hollow Valley from winter's stark white into the vibrant greens and wildflower colors that Clara had come to associate with hope itself, having first arrived in this same valley during a similarly transformative season nearly a year earlier. It was during one of these early spring mornings, working together in the garden, that had become such a significant symbol of their relationship's growth, that Clara shared news that would add an entirely new dimension to their already transformed lives. "Caleb." Her voice carried a particular nervous excitement that immediately caught his attention. "I need to tell you something." He looked up from the fence post he'd been repairing, noting the mixture of anticipation and uncertainty crossing her expression. "What is it?" "I'm expecting." The words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back, uncertain how he'd receive them. "We're going to have a child, Caleb." For a moment, Caleb simply stood frozen, processing the enormity of what she'd just told him, watching her uncertainty grow as his silence stretched longer than she'd apparently anticipated. "Caleb, please say something." He crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, pulling her into an embrace so fierce it startled a surprised laugh from her throat. "A child!" he repeated, disbelief and overwhelming joy warring in his voice. "We're having a child." "You're happy I wasn't certain, given everything with Sarah, whether this might bring up complicated feelings about—" "I've never been happier about anything in my entire life." Caleb pulled back just enough to look at her directly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Clara, you gave me back my capacity for joy when I genuinely believed it permanently lost. Now you're giving me the chance to build an actual family, something I'd stopped allowing myself to even imagine as possible." Clara's answering smile carried pure, radiant happiness. "I love you, Caleb Whitmore, more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone." "I love you too," completely irrevocably in ways that continue surprising me every single day. They stood together in that garden, surrounded by the vegetables and flowers Clara had coaxed back to life through months of patient, dedicated care. Both of them overwhelmed by the enormity of the future suddenly opening before them, a future neither of them could have imagined. That difficult afternoon, when Clara had stepped off a train with nothing but a small suitcase and desperate, unshakable hope. Their daughter arrived that autumn during the same season that had witnessed their wedding just 1 year earlier, her birth attended by Doc Ellison and overseen anxiously by Caleb, who paced the hallway outside their bedroom with considerably more nervous energy than he'd displayed even during the most dangerous confrontations with Walter Hayes. "She's beautiful," Clara whispered, exhausted but radiant, holding their daughter for the first time as Caleb finally entered the room, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "What should we name her?" Clara considered this seriously, studying their daughter's tiny, perfect features. "I was thinking Sarah Eleanor. Sarah for the woman who came before me, whose memory helped shape the man you became. Eleanor for your mother." Caleb's breath caught, entirely overwhelmed by the profound generosity and understanding behind Clara's suggestion. "You'd want to name our daughter after Sarah." "I think it's important she understands her father's complete history, Caleb. Not as something to fear or avoid, but as an integral part of the family she's being born into. Sarah's memory helped create this life we're building together, even if indirectly. I think that deserves honoring, not hiding." Caleb kissed his wife gently, then their daughter's tiny forehead tears finally spilling freely down his face. "Sarah Eleanor Whitmore. I think that's perfect." They sat together through that first evening, their small family complete, in ways Caleb had genuinely believed impossible just 2 years earlier, watching their daughter sleep peacefully. Between them, both of them overwhelmed by gratitude for the unlikely, difficult path that had led them to this particular moment of profound, hard-won happiness. Years later, Red Hollow Valley residents would still occasionally recount the story of Caleb Whitmore and his mail-order bride, the dramatic tale of fraud and betrayal, exposed of a dangerous man, finally brought to justice of a widower who'd sworn off love, entirely finding it anyway in the most unexpected circumstances. But for Caleb and Clara themselves, the story had long since transformed into something considerably quieter and more profound than dramatic legend. Simply the foundation of an ordinary, extraordinary life, built together, filled with the accumulated small moments of genuine partnership that mattered far more than any singular dramatic confrontation ever could. Sarah Eleanor grew alongside 2 younger brothers. Over the following years, the ranch continuing to flourish under her parents' combined dedication, the once lonely house transformed permanently into the kind of warm, laughter-filled home Clara had always envisioned it becoming. From that very first evening, she'd insisted a home should feel like someone actually lived there. On quiet evenings, watching their children play across the same porch, where their own relationship had first deepened into something transformative, Caleb would sometimes find Clara's hand seeking his. Both of them silently acknowledging the remarkable, unlikely journey that had brought them to this particular moment of profound contentment. "Do you ever think about that day at the station?" Clara asked one such evening, years after the events that had first brought them together. "How different everything might have turned out if you'd simply put me back on that train." Caleb considered the question seriously, watching their children's laughter echo across the yard, where danger had once threatened everything they'd eventually built together. "I think about it often," he admitted, "and every single time I find myself more grateful than I can properly express that something in me refused to let you leave, even when every rational instinct insisted it would be simpler that way." "What changed your mind that very first day, I've always wondered. You didn't cry and beg, even though you had every reason to. You stood there exhausted and frightened and completely alone in an unfamiliar place, and you still found the strength to defend yourself against that ranch hand's cruel comment." Caleb's thumb traced gentle patterns across the back of her hand, the same gesture he'd repeated countless times over their years together. "Something about that fierce, stubborn dignity told me you were exactly the kind of person worth taking a chance on, regardless of how terrified I was of losing anyone else. I'm glad you took that chance." "So am I. Every single day I'm grateful beyond words that you refused to simply disappear quietly the way everyone expected. Clara leaned into him, watching their children continue playing in the golden evening light, both of them finally completely secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges life might yet present, they would face them together, as they had every difficulty since that fateful afternoon when a grieving widower's carefully guarded heart had finally irrevocably opened to let someone in. Caleb Whitmore had once believed love was simply another mechanism for inevitable devastating loss. Clara Bennett taught him through every difficult trial and triumphant victory they'd shared together that love was instead the very thing worth risking everything to protect. And in the golden light of that Wyoming evening, surrounded by the family they'd built from nothing but courage, stubborn hope, and an unshakable refusal to let fear dictate their choices, both of them understood with absolute unwavering certainty that they had found something infinitely more valuable than either had ever believed possible to reclaim. They had found home, and this time nothing would ever take it away again.